gold tycoon in America in 1850. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 651 Python Project. A protracted war. This is not only the result Liang Zhao does not want to see, but also the result Liang Zhao cannot accept. Although Liang Zhao has achieved certain results in the construction of the central and western regions of North America, the operating time is limited after all. Once it falls into the quagmire of war, it will reach the stage of stalemate where the national strength is consumed. The current American Republic will definitely not be able to outlast the Northern Federation. There is no such possibility. Liang Zhao told Liang Zhao very decisively and firmly, "You don't have to worry about military affairs, just do your immigration work with peace of mind." If it really comes to the point of a protracted war, Liang Zhao would rather retreat to the North Platte Fortress Group and hold on, continuing to accumulate strength, rather than shed blood and compete with the Northern Federation for the Central Great Plains region. "So, I finally put my heart at ease," Liang Zhao nodded, feeling a little relieved. He continued, "Everything else can be done now, but there is one thing that cannot be delayed, that is machine tools. Machine tools are the most in short supply in the border areas. Can you ship a batch of machine tools here first? At least ship a batch of mother machines and important spare parts here first." It's not that there is no industry in the central border areas, but Liang Zhao has been focusing on supporting the military industry in North Platte before, and transferred part of the military production capacity in Sacramento to North Platte, in order to establish a relatively complete military industry in North Platte that can meet the needs of the front line and save future military expenses on the Eastern Front. In the field of civilian industry, the central border areas are relatively weak. Most of the factory machinery in the central border areas relies on the supply of the West Coast, and even the mechanical parts with slightly more complicated processes and higher precision requirements cannot be manufactured. Under the current situation where transportation capacity is allocated to military use first, the civilian factories in the central border areas dare not let the machines run at high loads at all. In order to protect the machines, they can only reduce production capacity. The lack of production capacity further led to the shortage of local supplies, thus forming a vicious cycle. I will grant you a special approval of 150 train cars, but these 150 train cars can only be used to transport machine tools and mechanical parts. If I find that the immigration officers are partial to each other and use these train cars to transport or smuggle things that should not be brought, don't blame me for turning my back on you." Liang Zhao is not an unreasonable person. After careful consideration of Liang Zhao's reasonable request, he still allocated some precious transportation capacity to Liang Zhao, and at the same time, he did not forget to give Liang Zhao a shot of prevention. Having personally experienced the shortage of materials in California during the early days of the gold rush, Liang Zhao knew very well what transportation capacity meant to the central frontier region, where almost all materials were scarce. "I will personally watch these train cars, and I will be held responsible if there is any problem," Liang Zhao vowed to Liang Zhao. "The Pacific Railway is the lifeblood of our American Republic. Have there been spies from the East trying to destroy the Pacific Railway recently?" Liang Zhao finally asked about railway safety. "Yes, since March, the railway police have arrested more than a dozen suspicious people during patrols. The case is still under investigation. Pinkerton is in charge of this matter," Liang Zhao replied. During the conversation, Liang Zhao's special train unknowingly entered the South Platte River Valley. The Platte River Valley is the most densely populated area in the central frontier area, except Denver and Cheyenne City. Unlike Denver and Cheyenne City, the river valley is narrow and long, and the widest part of the Platte River Valley is only 8 or 9 kilometers, so there are no particularly large cities in the Platte River Valley. The local settlement form is mainly small and medium-sized rural towns. 312 large and small villages and towns are distributed along the river bank. Sailing boats with white sails and small steamers spewing black smoke are sailing on the river in an orderly manner. Most of the flat land near the two sides of the river has been reclaimed into rice fields and vegetable gardens for growing rice and vegetables. Rice is the staple food with the highest unit price in the American Republic. As long as natural conditions permit, farmers in the American Republic, whether Chinese or a small number of white people from the East, generally give priority to growing rice. These rice fields were the first to be reclaimed 2 years ago. The rice and vegetables produced were sold to the troops stationed in the Pratt Fortress Group, except for some of them being kept as food. The gentle slopes outside were used to grow corn, wheat, sweet potatoes and the steeper slopes could only grow some fruit trees. Along the way, Liang Zhao introduced his work results to Liang Zhao incessantly. With West Virginia announcing its accession to the Union, the first batch of mobilized soldiers had all arrived in Washington, and the Navy had completed mobilization and was able to be put into combat. The situation in the East gradually tilted towards the Northern Union, which was increasingly favorable to the North. The person in charge of the Eastern Front Battlefield Command was Lieutenant General Scott, the Secretary of War, the highest-ranking general in the Northern Union. The situation reversed, and Scott was no longer satisfied with being passively trapped in a corner of Washington, but was seeking to take the initiative. As a veteran of the Northern veteran level, Scott knew what the Federal Army was like, the combat effectiveness of the Southern rebels, and the quality of the generals, but at least he knew it in his heart. Scott knew that with the current mob of the Federal Army, it would be impossible to achieve a quick victory over the Southern rebels on land in the short term. He was very sure that the current breakthrough point of the Northern Army was at sea, not on land. The Army of the Northern Federal Army did not have an absolute advantage over the Army of the Southern rebels, but their Navy had an overwhelming advantage over the Navy of the Southern rebels. In such a large South, the only naval force that caught Scott's eye was a medium-sized shallow-water heavy artillery fleet controlled by the Texans. However, this fleet built by the Texans at a high price was an absolute green water fleet, which was only used to defend the port of Houston and could not be used for ocean operations. Therefore, the Texan fleet could not pose a threat to the Federal Navy. In the office of the War Department in Washington, the federal capital, Winfield Scott was standing in front of a table covered with maps, his eyes focused and determined. Scott was wearing a straight blue general uniform, with the gold lines on his shoulders gleaming against the setting sun. His right hand held a long feather pen steadily, while his left hand trembled slightly as he leaned on the table, drawing on the spread-out map. Behind Scott stood two generals, both of whom raised their hands in the air and looked nervous. They were worried that the elderly federal veteran would collapse due to overwork. Of course, they also hoped in their hearts that Scott would collapse. After all, there was only one position for the Secretary of War. The two generals behind Scott were General Henry Halleck, who had just been promoted by Lincoln to Chief of Staff of the Army, and Gideon Welles, a Republican general and an important member of Lincoln's cabinet and Secretary of the Navy. The map drawn by Scott detailed the topography and transportation routes of the southern states, including the rivers, ports and railways in the south. Scott slowly pointed the feather pen to the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast, where the maritime supply lines on which the Confederacy depended for survival. Scott frowned and whispered to himself, "To win this war, we must cut off all lifelines in the south, isolate them, and prevent them from getting outside assistance and supplies." He continued to move the pen tip northward along the Mississippi River. The winding Mississippi River seemed like a natural barrier running through the north and south. Scott knew that the Mississippi River would be the most important part of the North's strategy. "We need to control the Mississippi River," Scott murmured, "cut off the connection between the South and the West from the inside, divide the South and the West, gradually weaken their resistance, and defeat them one by one. I must not only cut off the connection between the South and Europe, but also the connection between the South and the West." Although the two rebel forces have not yet formed an alliance, Scott's thoughts gradually became clear, and he drew a series of blockade lines on the map, surrounding the major ports and main transportation routes in the South. Finally, his eyes fell on the map of the entire South, surrounded, as if a huge python was tightly coiling around its prey, gradually tightening. "This is my plan. I call it the Python Plan." Scott finally put down the pen in his hand and looked out the window. It seemed that there was a python wriggling in the distant sky. "It is difficult for us to win a quick victory, but we can strangle the enemy slowly like a python, suffocating them until they completely lose the power to resist. Whether your plan can be successfully implemented depends on whether McClellan can stabilize the situation in the central frontier." Henry Halleck pointed his finger at Omaha on the map, and then his finger slowly moved westward. "In the past 2 years, Liang Zhao has been immigrating in these places on a large scale, and even won the support of Indian tribes, mainly the Cheyenne tribe. The local situation is not optimistic for us. The fact that most of the Platte River, a tributary of the Mississippi River, was under the control of the Western rebels was a concern for the three high-ranking Northern generals present. Mason reported these situations to me many times 2 years ago. He is a competent officer. Scott couldn't help but frown when he mentioned this. It's a pity that if Mr. Lincoln could have become president earlier, the situation in the Central Frontier region might not be as bad as it is today. Although the previous President Buchanan was unbearable, he was not unkind to Scott. Thinking of this, Scott subconsciously controlled himself and swallowed the three words incompetent back into his stomach, and changed to a relatively more euphemistic statement. General Mason is very dissatisfied with McClellan. I am worried that this will affect the overall situation in the Central Frontier region, Henry Halleck said worriedly. I can understand Mason's dissatisfaction. I will find a way to appease him. I believe Mason is a sensible person. Scott put down the quill in his hand. As for McClellan, we can't say that he did anything wrong. If he gave the new soldiers to Mason, it would not be of any benefit to the defense of the Kearny Fortress Group, but would only cause trouble for Mason. If you reluctantly gave the old soldiers to Mason, it would not only weaken the defense of Omaha, but also delay the training of the second round of mobilized soldiers. In the final analysis, this is because we were not fully prepared and the mobilization came too late. Chapter 652. There are many issues that the congressmen need to consider. Scott had been in the Army for many years, and had slowly climbed to the top of the American military by earning military merits and gaining seniority. He was not a man who only talked about military affairs on paper. He could understand the difficulties of McClellan and Mason. It was meaningless to tangle with who was right and who was wrong. At the moment, what he cared most about was that the Anaconda Plan he had carefully formulated would be recognized by Lincoln and passed by Congress as soon as possible. He was the marshal in charge of coordinating the overall situation. He had to consider issues from a strategic level. Both McClellan and Mason were just pawns in Scott's strategic layout. Henry, you should organize my plan and give it to the president. Make sure that this plan is passed as soon as possible. Scott felt very tired. After all, he was an older man, and his energy could not be compared with that of young people. Formulating the Anaconda Plan had exhausted his last bit of energy, and Scott was now extremely tired. Yes, sir. Chief of Staff Henry Halleck carefully cleaned up the desk for Scott, and quietly left the office of the Secretary of War with a pile of thick plan documents. Sir, the Navy caught the envoys sent by the Southern puppet regime to Britain and France during patrol. They are trying to establish diplomatic relations with Britain and France. Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy who had been silent, reported to Scott. Scott was not surprised to hear this, as if he had expected the South's move. Gideon, you are a cabinet member, you have the right to report this matter directly to the president. Scott leaned back slightly on the back of the chair to make his old body more comfortable. Sir, I understand, but this is not a long-term solution. It is only a temporary solution. The Southern puppet regime will definitely continue to send envoys to Europe. Our coastline in the Atlantic is more than 8,000 miles long. It is impossible for our Navy to intercept them every time, Gideon Welles said worriedly. Negotiating with Britain and France and putting pressure on them through diplomatic channels is the fundamental solution. Scott's face sank. Gideon Welles' words also touched his pain point. His Anaconda Plan could intercept ships from the south, but he had no right to intercept ships from Britain and France. If the ships from Britain and France really wanted to break through the defense line of the Northern Federal Fleet to transport supplies to the south, he would really have no way. Would the heads of government of these two powerful countries, Britain and France, really care about the pressure from the United States? The upset Scott interrupted Gideon Welles impatiently. This is not something you should worry about. Go directly to report to the president. I'm tired and need to rest. Scott's Anaconda Plan was soon presented to President Lincoln's desk after being sorted out and improved by Henry Halleck. After carefully reading and evaluating the Anaconda Plan with cabinet members, Lincoln greatly appreciated Scott's Anaconda Plan. Compared with the vast number of rabble-rousers in the civilian population and the middle and lower-level officers in the military who were obsessed with making achievements, most of the senior government officials represented by Lincoln's cabinet were relatively sober-minded. The so-called theory of quick victory and quick decision, which was to suppress the rebellion in the South in 3 months, and then to pacify the West Coast in another 3 months to completely end the largest internal turmoil since the founding of the United States, was impossible to achieve. Even though Lincoln firmly believed that the North would eventually win, and was very optimistic and confident about the outcome of the Civil War, He only thought that he could end the war within his first term. Lincoln also agreed to use the stronger national strength of the Northern Federation to drag down the South and the West and win the Civil War with absolute strength. Scott's Anaconda Plan coincided with Lincoln's ideas. Lincoln strongly supported Scott's plan and praised Scott's foresight in front of all cabinet members, saying that he was the most strategic general of the federal government. In fact, it is true that an old man in the family is like a treasure. Scott was the most outstanding senior general of the Northern Army in the early days of the Civil War. It was a pity that Scott was too old to go to the front line to command specific battles. But the free American national conditions are here. America is a democratic country. Lincoln and his cabinet highly approve of Scott's Anaconda Plan, but it does not mean that the Anaconda Plan can be passed and implemented immediately. Whether the Anaconda Plan can be successfully implemented depends on many congressmen in Congress who know nothing about military affairs, lack objective understanding of the South and the West, and lack long-term vision. Lincoln and his cabinet only need to submit plans, while the congressmen need to consider more issues. As Lincoln expected, the Anaconda Plan was opposed by more than two-thirds of the members as soon as it was submitted to Congress, and the members who opposed the Anaconda Plan were mainly representatives from the northeastern states of New York and Pennsylvania. These members of Congress have their own ulterior motives. Some hope to make a quick decision, restore normal economic order as soon as possible, and minimize economic losses. Some have already made a dream in the Capitol to divide up the high-quality assets of the South and the West Coast after the war, and take the cotton, sugar cane, and tobacco plantations in the South and the gold, oil, and factories in the West for themselves. The congressmen whose seats were empty had already arrived at the front, ready to witness history and see the 100,000-strong armies of the Northern Union conquer the South and the West and complete the great cause of unification. These congressmen were no longer opening champagne at halftime, but were opening champagne to celebrate before the game started. These bastards. Don't you think the front is chaotic enough? Lincoln was almost mad to vomit blood when he learned that some congressmen could not wait to watch the battle at the Washington and Omaha fronts. It would be fine to go to the Washington front to watch the battle. After all, the main force of the Southern Army was only more than 30 miles away from Washington. As the capital, Washington not only needed the security and stability of the two wings and the rear, but also needed greater strategic depth in the front. The Northern Army must drive the Southern Army further south to reduce the space for the Southern Army to move. Lincoln was ready to fight the South, and the battle would start in the next few days. But what the hell was he going to Omaha to watch the battle? Lincoln and his cabinet had not yet declared war on the Western rebels, and were still negotiating with the West to delay the outbreak of the war on the Western Front as much as possible. I just realized that the number of votes was wrong when I was counting the votes just now, and then I found that 46 congressmen were absent from the meeting. Lincoln's President Nickel lowered his head to explain to Lincoln. What these congressmen did was really ridiculous. Their arrival at the front will inevitably add pressure to the generals on the front line, especially some congressmen who are retired officers, who will inevitably point fingers at the generals on the front line. Once these retired officers who have left the military for many years intervene in the command and dispatch of the front line, the result will be disastrous and irreversible. Humph. Let them go. Their legs are on their bodies, and I can't control where they go. Lincoln snorted very angrily, and then explained to Nickel, do more work for the senators first. There are still many senators who support the Anaconda Plan. As for the congressmen, let's slow down for a while. In addition, send a telegram to McClellan and tell him that no one has the right to interfere with his work except for the direct orders of the War Department and me. Understood, sir, Nickel said with a sad face. Sir, I am worried that this plan will be sent to Davis and Liang Zhao's desk soon. Chapter 653. It's not that the West cannot leave us, but that we cannot leave the West. Your worries are unnecessary. Lincoln had a bitter smile on his face. It's only a matter of time before this plan is sent to Liang Zhao and Davis' desks. Hundreds of congressmen have read the plan of the Anaconda Project, and leaks are inevitable. But Lincoln was powerless to do anything about it. Although Lincoln was disgusted with the Citizens Party, led by Liang Zhao and Fremont, having a one-man show in California. But sometimes Lincoln also envied Liang Zhao. He believed that with Liang Zhao's personality, if the West wanted to pass a strategic plan, Liang Zhao would at most go through his cabinet, and would not send it to their parliament for voting and discussion, so there was no need to worry about leaks. What should we do with the arrested envoys sent to Europe by the South? Nickel asked Lincoln. Detain them, Lincoln said after sorting out his thoughts. Let our people in Europe strengthen propaganda efforts. European countries led by Britain and France, especially Britain, have always liked to stand on the dry shore to criticize our barbaric slavery system in the United States, demanding that we abolish this inhumane system and embrace of the civilized world. Now we really have to sweep slavery into the garbage dump of history. If they are really people in the civilized world as they say, they should stand on our side, that is, the side of civilization, instead of flirting with the slave owners in the South. Although the United States of America has not yet officially issued a bill to completely abolish slavery, after completely tearing its face with the southern slave states, the abolition of slavery is a foregone conclusion. Since its founding, the United States has been criticized by civilized European countries led by Britain for retaining slavery. Now those civilized dealers in Europe are flirting with the South, and even have the signs of providing assistance to the South. This made Lincoln feel extremely uncomfortable. Lincoln knew very well that the European countries that rose first, such as Britain, were so concerned about the slavery issue in the United States across the ocean. It had nothing to do with humanity and civilization, but was out of political stance. Take Britain as an example. The atrocities committed by the British against the people of South Asia and other colonies were even worse than those committed by the slave owners in the South. When a great famine occurred in South Asia, killing tens of millions of people, Lincoln did not see the well-dressed and civilized gentlemen in the Palace of Westminster accusing the officials of the British Indian authorities of inaction. Instead, they wantonly pulled out grain from Bengal and sold it. This move can only be targeted at the South, but there is no slavery in the West. Hearing the conversation between Lincoln and Nicholas, Secretary of State Seward, who was smoking in the corridor, came up. Seward wanted to sever the connection between the West and European countries and did not want the West to gain support from European countries. Liang Zhao has a good personal relationship with Napoleon III. Now Napoleon III is on a personal expedition in Mexico. I have received accurate news that the West is providing assistance to Napoleon II's personal expedition. I am very worried that the West will get too close to France. Napoleon III is an ambitious monarch who intends to expand the influence of the French Empire in America. More than 80 years ago, an emperor of France helped them win the difficult War of Independence. It is hard to say whether this French emperor more than 80 years later will also support a new country in North America. Everything has its priorities. At present, the priority of the South is obviously higher than that of the West, Lincoln said. Liang Zhao seems to have seen that we have no sincerity in peace talks. According to the intelligence, he has already set off for North Platte. Seward looked up at Lincoln. The second batch of mobilized soldiers has not yet formed combat effectiveness. They are not the opponent of the Western Army, Lincoln pondered for a moment and said helplessly. He has been to the West and observed Liang Zhao's Western Army up close. He was deeply impressed by the strict military appearance, strict discipline and excellent weapons of the Western Army. The hastily mobilized conscripted soldiers of the federal government, without completing reorganization and training, would find it difficult to defeat the Western Army even though they had a numerical advantage over the Western Army. More than 40 senators and congressmen, led by Aspinwall, jointly demanded that we must take tough measures against the West. When Seward mentioned Aspinwall and others, he couldn't help but show disgust on his face. They asked us to take military action against the West as soon as possible. Even if the mobilized soldiers cannot be put into battle immediately, at least some economic action should be taken to put pressure on the West, such as confiscating the Crystal Palace Mall, a representative asset of the West in New York. Nonsense. Is the Crystal Palace a purely Western asset? William, the eldest son of the Vanderbilt family, and the Vanderbilt family also holds a large part of the shares of the Crystal Palace, Lincoln said angrily. Everyone knows that the Astor family and the Western Consortium and those Dutch in New York have long been resentful. They are trying to get revenge. Lincoln was naturally aware of the little thoughts of Aspinwall and others. In the early years, the Astor family was squeezed out of California by Liang Zhao and the Dutch upstarts in New York, and failed to get a share of the gold rush in the West. This is a well-known fact to all Americans. Lincoln was not stupid enough to be used as a gun by Aspinwall and others. His predecessor Buchanan was coerced by the old money in the Northeast to impose economic sanctions on the West during his tenure, inciting the anti-Chinese movement and trying to get the sales rights of chemical products headed by kerosene in the West and the East. But what was the result? Did the sanctions end in a dismal defeat for the East? Western products have penetrated into every aspect of Eastern people's lives. If economic ties with the West are completely severed, The lower-class people will not have good quality and cheap kerosene to use, and middle-class families will not be able to buy reliable and reasonably priced Butterfly brand sewing machines and Puma brand bicycles. The Western locomotives purchased by the railway company and the subsequent maintenance services will become a problem. Various factories will use more expensive animal ointment to lubricate the machinery, etc. If they can produce similar products of the same quality as the West, or even slightly inferior in quality, why should we be economically controlled by the West? Seward looked like he was disappointed. Successive governments have protected these people too well. Now they can't compete with their European counterparts, and they can't even compete with the West. Seward worked as a legal advisor to the Atlantic Railway Company with Lincoln in his early years. He knew very well that once economic ties with the West were severed, the national economy and people's livelihood of the entire Federation would be affected. 10 years ago, the West could not do without the East, but times have changed. Now the situation is just the opposite. It is the East that cannot do without the West. Lincoln's judgment was correct. Before the Anaconda Plan was approved, Liang Zhao, who had just arrived in North Platte, had already received the text of the Anaconda Plan. These texts were translated by the staff of the telegraph office overnight after receiving the telegram. Although the image data was missing, the staff of the General Staff worked hard to draw the relevant maps of the Anaconda Plan. Scott is really handsome and talented. If Scott were 20 or 30 years younger, he would be a very difficult opponent for us. After carefully reading the Anaconda Plan, Liang Zhao commented generously. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 654, Thin White Line. The overall idea of the Python Plan in Liang Zhao's hand is the same as that of the Python Plan proposed by Scott in history, but there are some differences in details. The Python Plan emphasizes the use of the water system of the Mississippi River Basin and the existing railway network to build a complete defense system in the central frontier area, in order to achieve the strategic goal of containing the forces of the West in the North Platte River Valley. Scott wants to realize his Python Plan, at least he has to take over the whole of Texas. Kruger saw the flaws of the Python Plan at a glance and added, in addition to the Pacific Railway, we can also establish a connection with the South through the Guard Railway. Kruger admired Liang Zhao's strategic vision very much. When the Guard Railway Plan was proposed, not many people were optimistic about and supported the construction of the Guard Railway. Most people believed that a Pacific Railway would be enough to connect the East and the West. The South's economy is relatively backward and the population is sparse, so the economic benefits of building the Guard Railway are really limited. Kruger even suspected that Liang Zhao had expected such a day, so he ignored the cost and rushed to build the Guard Railway before 1860. Scott, the old fox, should be able to see this problem, but he is temporarily powerless. Liang Zhao looked around at the senior generals of the American Republic Defense Army present. What made him feel gratified was that many new faces appeared. The group of teenagers who were sent to West Point Military Academy and Virginia Military Academy began to take up the responsibility of the Army. If the intensity of the Crimean War is the same, how long can we continue to fight with our current ammunition reserves? 3 months. Elvis gave a rough answer after a rough calculation, but he still did not forget to add, but considering that our opponent is the Northern Federal Army, our ammunition reserves can at least support us to fight a high-intensity war for 5 months. Elvis once led a military inspection team to Crimea for inspection. This war was the most intense war in Europe in recent years. Liang Zhao compared this war in North America with the war between the European powers. Did Liang Zhao think that the intensity of this war would be comparable to the war between the European powers? This was unbelievable to Elvis. After all, since the Industrial Age, the intensity of war in no region could be compared with that in Europe. The civil war in the Qing dynasty was large in scale, so it might be comparable, but in essence, it was still a war between classical war and modern war, not a war in the Industrial Age. You mean, the Northern Federation Army is not as good as the Russian Army? Liang Zhao asked. No, sir. According to my investigation, the quality of the Northern Federation Army is worse than that of the Russian Army, but it cannot be compared with the Russian Army in terms of scale, Elvis said. The current Federal Army is lame, but no matter what, The industrial level of the Northern Federation is stronger than that of the Russian Empire, and the quality of its soldiers is better than that of the Russian army's serfs. Therefore, Elvis still believes that the Northern Federation Army is still stronger than the Russian army. It depends on the mobilization level of the federal government, Kruger thought for a long time before speaking. The last time the federal government implemented a full mobilization was more than 40 years ago. If the federal government's mobilization capabilities remain at the level of more than 40 years ago, the federal army will not be a threat. If the federal army can reach the mobilization capabilities of second-rate European countries, the federal army will be able to compete with European armies except Britain and France. Obviously, Liang Zhao was more satisfied with Kruger's answer. Mobilization capabilities are an important criterion for testing a modern country. More than 40 years ago, the United States was generally still an agricultural country. Its organizational mobilization capabilities during the Second War of Independence were undoubtedly disastrous, so it was not unfair for the United States to lose to Britain in that war. As for the two more recent Mexican-American wars, the United States had not yet reached the level of nationwide mobilization, so Kruger had no idea about the mobilization capabilities of the United States in the industrial age, so he did not dare to make a rash judgment. But as Liang Zhao, who knew more than 100 years later, had a clear understanding of the mobilization capabilities of the United States in the industrial age. Under Lincoln's organization, the Northern Federation certainly had the mobilization capabilities and organizational level of a second-rate European power, or even close to that of a quasi-first-rate European power. It's just that America's first general mobilization was for the Civil War, and I don't know whether this is a blessing or a curse. At least for the American citizens at this time, at least for the Southern citizens, it is unfortunate. Within 3 months, formulate a plan to annihilate the Northern Army of the Kearny Fortress Group in Omaha. Within 5 days, I want to see your battle plan. Liang Zhao issued an order. The existing ammunition and military supply reserves can fight a 3-month high-intensity war, which does not mean that the National Defense Army of the Republic of America can only fight for 3 months. It is just limited by the transportation capacity of the Pacific Railway and the limited production capacity of the North Platte Arsenal. The subsequent offensive will definitely slow down compared to the early stage of the battle. After the meeting, Liang Zhao asked Zeiss to send a telegram to Robert Lee and Davis, revealing to the South that they will launch a military operation in the near future, giving the Southern High Level a reassurance. The indecisive attitude of the Southern High Level made Liang Zhao despise the group of slave owners in the South. He knew what these slave owners in the South were thinking. It is nothing more than hoping that the support of the European powers and the Western Front battlefield can share the military pressure for them. Wanting independence without shedding too much blood, how could such a beautiful thing exist in this world? After all, these people in the South are still a group of guys who can't accomplish anything great. Do these guys really think that their position as the origin of cotton is irreplaceable? The cotton thread is very thin and fragile, so fragile that a 3-year-old child can easily break it. At the same time, it is the thickest and most powerful rope in the world. As long as we want, this thin cotton thread can suffocate the whole world, at the same time. Thousands of miles away in Richmond, Davis, the President of the Confederacy, was giving an inflammatory speech in Congress, showing his congressmen what he called white gold. The cotton textile industry in Lancaster, Derbyshire, Cheshire and other places in England is in an unprecedented period of prosperity. What has created this prosperity? It's cotton. Senator James Henry Hammond from South Carolina answered first. To be precise, it's cotton that is cheaper than India and Egypt. Hammond is a staunch secessionist, as well as an influential Southern politician and plantation owner. In his early years, he was famous in the South for his King Cotton theory. The so-called King Cotton theory is an extremely popular economic and political belief in the American South in the mid-19th century. It believes that cotton is the core of the American economy and even the global economy, and emphasizes the important position of the Southern plantation economy in the world economy. This concept can be briefly summarized as follows: the world economy depends on Britain, the British economy depends on the cotton textile industry, and the British cotton textile industry depends on the cotton imports from the South. Rounding it off means that the world economy depends on the cotton of the South. Southern plantation owners believe that European countries, especially Britain, which relied on cotton imports, had to support the South in the war, or at least ease the conflict through mediation. Chapter 655 Who is more reliable? Yes, cotton. Davis continued to talk on the podium. Last year alone, we exported 1.223 billion pounds of raw cotton to Britain, about 615,000 tons. Without our cotton, more than 2,700 cotton mills in Britain would not be able to operate, 30 million mule machines and 360,000 looms would become decorations, and more than 600,000 textile workers would be unemployed. Davis did do some homework. In 1860, more than 73% of Britain's raw cotton was imported from the South of America. The second largest importer, India, the pearl of the Queen of the British Empire, only contributed 243 million pounds of raw cotton, about 121,500 tons, to the British Empire. As one of the pillar industries of the British Empire, the cotton textile industry directly employed more than 600,000 workers in the local area. If the upstream and downstream related industries are counted, it is no exaggeration to say that the cotton textile industry is the livelihood of millions of textile workers in the British Empire. Also in 1860, the British Empire exported 318 million yards of cotton cloth and 11,200 tons of twisted thread and yarn. The total export value set a record of 36 million pounds. Whether it is for the sake of maintaining domestic stability or millions of pounds of tariff revenue, the British, who value money as their life, have no reason not to pay attention to their world's largest cotton-producing area. Unless the British ignore the lives of hundreds of millions of farmers in British India and let the old Indian farmers complete the great cause of changing rice to cotton and grow 600,000 tons of cotton for the British Empire in 1 or 2 years. Obviously, this is impossible. This is the confidence of Davis and others. They firmly believe that those European trading partners will definitely intervene in the situation in North America. At this point, Davis, with a surging emotion, raised the Python plan on the podium high, and then threw it heavily to the ground. So this crappy Python plan of the Northern Yankees is a joke. Even if they illegally detained our envoys sent to Europe, those Europeans will rush to our door when their cotton stocks run out. Davis's words caused bursts of laughter from the Southern congressmen. The meeting ended happily with the Southern congressman laughing at Scott's recklessness and Lincoln's lack of wisdom. Mr. President, an urgent telegram. The meeting had just ended, and Robert Lee, who had been waiting outside the Congress for a long time, hurriedly found Davis, who was still eager to get back to work. Liang Zhao has arrived in North Platte, and they will launch a military operation against the Northern Army within a week. Oh, Davis, full of suspicion, took the telegram from Robert Lee. After reading it carefully, he still looked undecided. Is he trying to instigate us to have a decisive battle with the Northern Army first? Davis knew very well that the war between the North and the South was inevitable. In addition to actively contacting European countries across the Atlantic, Davis was also actively preparing for war. But Davis still had his own little tricks in mind, which was to hope that the Western Army and the Northern Army would fight on the Western Front to disperse the military strength of the Northern Federation and create opportunities for them to go north and defeat the Northern Federation. The situation in Richmond is getting worse and worse. Whether Liang Zhao is just putting on a show or really wants to take action against the Federal Army in Fort Kearny in Omaha, we should send troops as soon as possible to eliminate the Northern Army less than 30 miles away from Richmond, Robert Lee said to Davis. Instead of pinning our hopes on European countries across the ocean, it is better to echo the American Republic on the North American continent, squeeze the strategic space of the Northern Federation from the South and West, force the North to recognize the fait accompli of our independence as soon as possible, and end the war as soon as possible. Robert Lee believed that Davis had too high expectations for the so-called European allies, and it was even a bit unrealistic. After all, no European country has yet made a clear statement of support for the Southern Confederacy. Compared with European countries across the ocean, Robert Lee believed that the American Republic on the North American continent was a more reliable and more worthy strategic partner. Although Sacramento has not clearly expressed its willingness to form an alliance with them so far, the American Republic is still the only country that has steadily provided them with arms, so Robert Lee believes that it is a more practical choice to be friendly with the American Republic and cooperate in combat. Robert Lee advocated sending troops as soon as possible for both public and private considerations. In terms of public, he hoped to attack before the first batch of mobilized soldiers of the Northern Army were fully prepared, so as to inflict the greatest damage on the Northern Army. Personally, he hoped to move the front northward so that his hometown of Virginia would not be affected by the war as much as possible. Robert Lee had read the military survey report on the Crimean battlefield submitted to him by McClellan and others, And he also knew the destructive power of today's guns and artillery. He did not want Virginia to become the next Crimea, and he did not want Richmond to become the next Sevastopol. What if this is just smokescreen released by Liang Zhao? Have you considered the consequences? Davis was quite dissatisfied with Robert Lee's advice. Compared with the American Republic, which had just separated from the United States, Davis had higher expectations for European partners. Since Liang Zhao said that military action would be taken against the Yankees within a week, let's wait and see. Wait for him for a week. Davis was not an ignorant person. On the contrary, before he became president, Davis paid more attention to information from the West. It's just that Davis had previously learned about the West through newspapers and at most some photos. He had never been to the West in person. Davis believed that although the West had made great progress in the past 12 years, the development time was still very limited after all, and its strength could not compete with the Northern Federation at all. Furthermore, Davis himself was a military man. The foundation of the West was in the West Coast, while the area where Liang Zhao wanted to deploy troops was in the central frontier area, which was thousands of miles apart. It was much more difficult to deploy troops on a large scale with a rear base thousands of miles away than when the Southern Army crossed mountains and ridges to capture California and Oregon during the Mexican-American War. Therefore, when Davis saw Liang Zhao's telegram about launching a military operation against the Northern Army, he was skeptical. Sir, a week is enough time for the Northern Yankees to complete the reorganization of several militia regiments. Seeing Davis' attitude, Robert Lee said anxiously, "The sooner we send troops, the better." Robert Lee was one of the few generals in the Southern Army who knew the Southern Army, the Northern Army, and the Western Army. He knew very well that there was a huge disparity in national strength between the North and the South. The longer it was delayed, the more unfavorable the situation would be for them. Therefore, Robert Lee hoped to send troops as soon as possible. As for the assistance from European countries, Robert Lee did not hold much hope. Liang Zhao was a man who was happy to expand his living space and had coveted the central frontier for a long time. Robert Lee tended to believe that Liang Zhao really wanted to use troops in the central frontier, otherwise he would not have had to go to North Platte in person. "Okay, Robert, go back and wait for news," Davis said impatiently. Chapter 656, Fewer Responses. These country bumpkins in the central region are so shameless. The irritable Sartre walked into Liang Zhao's office, cursing and complaining to Liang Zhao. "We sent out a total of 150 invitations, but only 36 people were willing to come to North Platte to attend the party. Among these 36 people, 10 are Chinese." In order to win over the local elites and wealthy merchants in the central frontier area, Liang Zhao asked Sartre to send invitations to these local elites and wealthy merchants, inviting them to a gathering in North Platte. Unexpectedly, there were few responses. Liang Zhao was not as angry as Sartre, and this result was within his expectations. His roots were in the West Coast region, and it was only in the past 3 years that he extended his tentacles to the central Great Plains. In the past 3 years, he had focused on operating the central frontier region in the North Platte River Valley, and had very limited control over the Great Plains east of the valley. As for economic ties, with a pitiful transportation capacity of the Pacific Railway, it could only barely maintain the operation of the areas along the line and the Platte River Valley, and could not project influence to other areas at all. In terms of economic ties, the villages and towns in the central border areas have closer ties with the Northern Federation. After all, the Northern Federation has a geographical advantage. Liang Zhao asked Sartre to send invitations to these people more to test their attitudes, and he did not expect to mobilize the manpower and material resources of the central border areas for his use now. At least 36 people bought our account. Liang Zhao piled the processed documents on his right hand and motioned Sartre to sit down and talk. "You are quite open-minded." Sartre took the tea from Zeiss. "The land in the central border areas is not all unowned. If we want to implement our national policies in these places, we can't avoid these people." "I know," Liang Zhao said. "The discipline of the new recruits of the Northern Union is very poor. Although McClellan is very good at training mobilized soldiers, he is still too inexperienced and lacks reputation to completely suppress the officers and soldiers from various states under his command. These country bumpkins in the central region have long complained about this. They are unwilling to keep the appointment. They may not be wholeheartedly on the side of the Northern Union, but are waiting and watching. The poor discipline of the U.S. military is a chronic disease that has not been cured in the 21st century. Moreover, It is now the mid-19th century, an era when the concept of the state is stronger than the concept of the country. The Americans will have to wait until the end of this war to truly establish the concept of the country. The second batch of mobilized soldiers under McClellan mainly came from the old northeastern states such as New York, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. People in these areas originally looked down on the country bumpkins in the central frontier areas. These people dared not act recklessly in the developed northeastern region with a dense population and a sound legal system. When they arrived in the central frontier area with a sparse population and a few policemen in a town, they could be said to have completely let themselves go. It is normal to borrow something from a fellow villager and care about the female family members of a fellow villager. As for the local civilian armed forces in the border areas, it is okay to let them bully the Indians. Faced with a serious modern state violence machine, the local civilian armed forces dared to be angry but dared not speak out. At the beginning of the war, the North lacked veterans with reputation enough to convince the public. No Northern general dared to pat his chest and guarantee that he would be able to suppress the generals under his command, except Scott. Wait and see, Sutter put down the teacup. After Liang Zhao said this, he was not so annoyed. The discipline of the Northern Army is indeed poor. Omaha has been tossed by them to an empty city. The fact that 36 people can come is enough to explain the problem, Liang Zhao said. Take advantage of this banquet to test their attitude and write down the names of these people first. After that, Liang Zhao sent Sutter away and checked the telegrams exchanged between Mason and McClellan. In this era, there was no concept of military telegraph network, let alone the awareness of encrypted telegrams. This is the same for both the North and the South. Both sides use the method of clear code to communicate and lack confidentiality awareness. The West, which uses encrypted code, is the outlier. The North leaked secrets frequently throughout the war. In addition to the fact that there are many Southern sympathizers in the North who actively provide confidential information to the South, the lack of confidentiality is also an important reason. Even a teenage temporary worker at the post office can participate in the deciphering of the North's confidential telegrams. Therefore, the content of the telegram between Mason and McClellan did not even require the deciphering step. Not to mention Liang Zhao, even the ordinary staff of the North Platte Post Office knew that the two Northern Army generals were not getting along now. Mason and McClellan were not on good terms, and this might be used. After lunch, Liang Zhao came to the Platte River for a walk. The main urban area of North Platte is located between the South Platte River and the North Platte River. The two rivers meet in the east of North Platte City. The North and South Platte Rivers are the natural barrier of North Platte City, shaping this frontier town that is easy to defend and difficult to attack. Although this place has geographical advantages and is easy to defend but difficult to attack, Liang Zhao hopes that in 3 months, North Platte will no longer be a frontier town. North Platte is not only a frontier town at present, but also a shipping center in the central frontier region. The only shipyard in the central frontier region that can manufacture steamships is located in the north of the city. The North Platte shipyard is busy in 3 shifts, and the workers in the shipyard are repairing the steamships requisitioned by the military. This battle is related to the fate of the country. Liang Zhao did not hold back and took out almost all the assets he could get. The regular army has 3 infantry brigades, the newly expanded artillery brigade, the cavalry brigade, the machine gun regiment, the rocket corps, and the militia from all over the country who came to assist in the battle. The total number of troops participating in the war is more than 60,000. Relying solely on railways and mules and horses is definitely not enough to meet the logistical supply needs of more than 60,000 people, so Liang Zhao ordered the requisition of almost all the steamships nearby. Liang Zhao walked around the shipyard and was pleased to find that more than 80% of the workers in the shipyard were young Chinese, many of whom were senior technicians trained from technical schools in San Francisco and Los Angeles. 10 years ago, there were only a handful of Chinese who could build and repair steamships, and senior technicians could only be hired from the East with high salaries. Now Liang Zhao has the ability to make money. This is the reason why Liang Zhao dared to challenge the Northern Federation. The North Platte River is not a very suitable inland waterway for shipping. The average width of the river during the non-flood season is about 50 to 100 meters, and the water depth is usually between 1 and 2 meters. Due to its shallow water depth and narrow river channel, it is difficult for large ships to sail on it. The shipyard is overhauling some barges or small cargo ships, with a displacement ranging from 5 or 6 tons to 70 or 80 tons. Cargo ships with a displacement of more than 70 tons are very rare. After all, the natural endowment of the Platte River is still very limited, and it is difficult to achieve great things by staying in the Platte River Valley. In this era, the upper limit of the size of inland cities depends largely on the natural endowment of rivers. In order to develop the central frontier and compete in North America, Liang Zhao needs to seize a river with better natural endowments as a support, such as the Mississippi River. Chapter 657 New Players in North America. 1861. The sky in Mexico City was gray, as if shrouded in haze, which made people feel depressed. The streets of Mexico City were scattered with randomly discarded guns and even cannons. What surprised the first batch of French soldiers who entered the city was that these guns and cannons abandoned by the Mexican soldiers were as intact as their fortifications. After all, the Mexican army did not have the courage and determination to fight a war to defend the capital with the French army. When the French army completed the siege of Mexico City, only more than 7,000 people were able to continue to fight. However, after Mexican President Benito Juárez fled, more than 30,000 Mexican city defenders with sufficient ammunition and food chose to surrender to the French army. This is the second time that the capital of Mexico has been occupied by foreign troops since its founding in 1821. Although the Mexican authorities have learned from previous experiences and their war preparations have been relatively in place, and there are sufficient supplies in the city to fight a war of attrition with the invading enemy and severely damage the enemy, the Mexicans are not short of supplies. French soldiers entered Mexico City in neat formations, following the drumbeats of military music. The blue flag of the French army fluttered in the wind over Mexico City. The French soldiers' steel-nailed boots made neat and crisp sounds on the cobblestones, which frightened the residents of Mexico City. But curiosity drove the Mexican soldiers and civilians hiding behind the broken windows to peek through the cracks at the French troops entering the city. Fortunately, Napoleon III planned to occupy Mexico for a long time, so he restrained the French army before entering the city, and the French army itself had sufficient supplies. There was no serious robbery in Mexico City like when it was occupied by the U.S. military. Amid the rumbling salutes, Napoleon III rode a majestic white horse and slowly stepped into the land he conquered. The French soldiers lined up on both sides of the street saluted their emperor. Napoleon III enjoyed the admiration of the soldiers to his heart's content. This was the highlight of his reign. Since Napoleon III ascended the throne, France's industrialization has been advancing at an unprecedented speed, and he has made remarkable achievements in domestic affairs and people's livelihood. What he lacks is the achievement of military exploits. Although he defeated Tsarist Russia in the Crimean War, broke the shackles of the Vienna system on France, and swept away the haze of the fall of the First French Empire hanging over the heads of the French. But this is far from enough for Napoleon III. He is a descendant of the Napoleon family. The French have higher expectations for Napoleon III, hoping that this monarch with the blood of the Napoleon family can make France great again like his uncle and regain its former glory. This is a country lacking cohesion and self-identity. This is the brief evaluation of the conquered country given by Napoleon III after entering the Mexican presidential palace. Conquering Mexico in just 1 month made Napoleon III feel boring and did not have much sense of accomplishment. Thanks to the adequate preparation and the logistical support provided by the American Republic, the French army suffered few casualties in this expedition, with only 206 killed and 667 wounded. The biggest casualties for the French army were not caused by the Mexican army, but by the plateau environment that the French army could not adapt to. Thousands of French soldiers lost their combat capability due to their inability to adapt to the environment of the Mexican plateau and had to recuperate in the rear. Even so, the French army still easily won the war. Your Majesty, the Mexican authorities have sold the right to build roads and the right to mine minerals along the railway to the American Republic. Do we recognize the treaty they signed with the American Republic? In a conversation with officials who surrendered in Mexico City, General Eli Ferdinand IV of the French army was surprised to find that the Mexicans had sold the right to build roads and some mineral mining rights in Mexico to the American Republic. It is well known that Mexico is very rich in mineral resources. Ford obviously cares about this part of the income and is unwilling to give it up. As I expected, it turns out that Mexico borrowed money from this neighbor in the north. Napoleon III was not surprised by this. Liang Zhao is quite far-sighted. The British Expeditionary Force and the Spanish Expeditionary Force must have taken money from Mexico if they were willing to withdraw voluntarily, and the Mexican government's finances naturally could not afford such a large sum of money. Otherwise, France, Britain and Spain would not have gone to the extent of armed debt collection. The money that the Mexican government paid back to the British and Spanish must have been borrowed, and there is no other creditor around Mexico that can provide huge loans to the Mexican authorities except the Republic of America. Liang Zhao is now deeply trapped in the quagmire of civil war and has no time to look south. Even if we do not recognize the treaty he signed with the old Mexican government, he can do nothing about us, Faure said. Besides, we will establish a new government sooner or later. Faure did not know whether Napoleon III wanted to directly occupy Mexico or support a puppet regime, but there was one thing he was sure of. That is, his expeditionary force would be stationed in Mexico, at least for a period of time. If the agreement signed between the old Mexican government and the Republic of America was recognized, he and his French expeditionary force would naturally be able to gain less benefits in Mexico. Napoleon III glanced at Trommeron, who had been silent on the side, and did not speak immediately. After careful consideration, Trommeron said to Napoleon III, "Your Majesty, I think this is inappropriate. Tell me about it." Napoleon III motioned Trommeron to continue. Compared with Faure, Trommeron had more contacts with the top leaders of the American Republic. He must know more about the American Republic than Faure. Napoleon III wanted to hear Trommeron's opinion. The treaty signed between the American Republic and the former Mexican government is reasonable and legal. If we do not recognize it, it will violate the spirit of the contract. Moreover, half of the debt owed by the former Mexican government to Britain and Spain has not been settled. If we do not recognize the treaty signed between the American Republic and Mexico, the American Republic will have enough reasons not to fulfill the agreement and settle the remaining debt. We will inevitably be angry with Britain and Spain for this. Trommeron analyzed very clearly. Mexico and the American Republic are very dependent on the American Republic economically. We have just taken over Mexico and have not yet established a firm foothold in Mexico. If the American Republic secretly trips us up, we will be unable to defend ourselves. Trommeron knows Liang Zhao and knows that Liang Zhao is not a person who can suffer losses or be bullied. It is true that with the strength of France, Liang Zhao naturally dare not do anything to France in public, but it is hard to say in secret. After all, Mexico and the American Republic are neighbors, and the cost and price that the American Republic needs to pay to influence Mexico is much smaller than that of France. Moreover, Trommeron does not want to have unpleasantness with two new neighbors in Europe because of the interests of a new colony. Chapter 658, Paper Talk. General Trommeron, it seems that you know the buyer of the Roland very well. Faure began to expose Trommeron's shortcomings in front of Napoleon III, saying in a sarcastic tone, "You have made outstanding contributions to the shipbuilding industry and the Navy of California, but it's a pity that Liang Zhao has not awarded you a medal so far." The Roland was a French active warship that Trommeron sold to Liang Zhao. What Faure said was true. The Roland was the first large warship Liang Zhao obtained. The Roland not only trained a group of technicians who understood modern steamships for the California shipyard, but now the naval officers of the Pacific Fleet and the Atlantic Fleet of the Republic of America have served on the Roland. Faure's intention to mock Trommeron with this matter is self-evident, which is nothing more than criticizing Trommeron for putting personal interests above national interests. At the beginning, Liang Zhao had to sell the Roland after evaluation. Besides, the gold obtained from the sale of the Roland did not fall into my pocket, Trommeron refuted righteously. My speech is entirely out of consideration for France's interests in America. Mexico can only serve as our bridgehead in North America. If we want to further expand our French influence in North America and intervene in the American Civil War, the American Republic is our best choice. In addition, maintaining good relations with the American Republic will also help consolidate our rule in Mexico and reduce the cost of maintaining colonies. Among the French naval commanders, Trommeron was not so greedy. He did not swallow all the money from the sale of the ship. Therefore, in the face of Faure's sarcasm, Trommeron still dared to respond positively. Faure himself did not hurry up, and Trommeron was not afraid of tearing his face with Faure in front of Napoleon III. Trommeron's words touched Napoleon III's heart. At present, industrialization in France was in full swing, and the military expenses of the Crimean War also needed to be repaid. France's finances were not abundant. Before the expeditionary force set out, Napoleon III was already thinking about how to achieve control over Mexico after the war at the lowest cost. After comprehensively considering the current situation in Mexico, Napoleon III is now more inclined to win over the royalists in Mexico and support a person from the European royal family who is recognized by the royalists in Mexico, preferably a member of the Habsburg family, who is easy to control, to be the puppet emperor of Mexico. In this way, he can indirectly control Mexico and put on a legitimate cloak of rule to avoid excessively angering European neighbors and reduce public pressure. As the second largest colonial power, France has many colonies, but compared with Britain, France has almost no colonies that can provide blood transfusions for its homeland. The colonies need blood transfusions from the French mainland, and the high maintenance costs have always been a headache for successive French governments. The Republic of America? General Tromelin, I don't think the Republic of America is our best choice. In terms of national strength and military power, the Confederate States of America is far stronger than the so-called Republic of America. In the American Civil War, Forey was more inclined to support the Confederacy and was not optimistic about the prospects of the Republic of America. Forey, you only see the appearance. The Republic of America is not as weak as you think. Tromelin still stood firm in his position. Although Tromelin and Forey had different opinions on whether to support the American Republic or the American Confederation, they both tacitly stood on the opposite side of the American Federation. This is also a true portrayal of the mentality of the French ruling class towards America at this time. They are afraid of the hardship of their brothers and afraid of their brothers driving Land Rover. To be fair, as a former British colony, the French ruling class hopes that America will become stronger and bigger to contain Britain. Although France and Britain are still allies now, the ruling classes of both Britain and France are very clear that there is no eternal friendship between Britain and France. Once France's national strength recovers to a certain extent, the British on the other side of the channel will feel like a thorn in their backs. The British will definitely use the continental balance policy to unite with other European powers to strangle France and weaken France's national strength. Similarly, France does not want America to be too powerful and threaten its position as the second great power. The rapid industrialization of America in the mid-19th century had already made the French feel threatened from across the Atlantic. As the representative of American industrialization, the Northern regime naturally became the target of containment by the French ruling class. Okay, 4, you do the aftermath in Mexico City. Tromelin, you follow me north and we'll go meet our new neighbor together. Napoleon III interrupted the two. He had his own considerations on which side to support more in line with France's interests in North America. Mexico City and California have been connected by train, and it doesn't take too much time to travel from here to California. Napoleon III decided to go to California for an inspection before making a decision. Previously, Napoleon II's knowledge of California was almost entirely from reports by Lee Goff and others, and he had never visited California in person. North Platte City, Frontier Military Region General Staff. Liang Zhao bent over his desk and carefully examined the battle plan formulated by the staff of the General Staff. The scale and complexity of this combat operation far exceeded any military operation Liang Zhao had participated in before. His energy is limited. For complex large-scale battles, he cannot do everything himself. He can only control the general direction. The specific action arrangements can only be handed over to these young staff officers who do not have much experience. The staff officers in the staff are very young. Except for 5 staff officers who are educated young people promoted from the front-line troops, the remaining 16 staff officers are military academy graduates from West Point Military Academy and Virginia Military Institute. To put it bluntly, most of whose staff officers are a group of young people who have only experience in paper talk. This battle plan can only be said to be mediocre, and there is nothing outstanding about it, Kruger, who also serves as the chief of staff, said to Liang Zhao. The battle plan presented to Liang Zhao has been revised and supplemented by him, and the original plan is even more terrible. As long as the battle plan can be implemented, there is nothing wrong with a mediocre plan, Liang Zhao said. The participating American Republic Defense Forces were only slightly smaller than the Omaha Federal Army, but the quality of the American Republic's soldiers, combat experience, weapons and equipment, and logistical support were definitely not something that the hastily mobilized conscripts in Omaha could match. Therefore, Liang Zhao judged that his own strength was currently inferior to the Federal Army that could participate in the war, and that this battle plan would definitely win the battle as long as it was executed without too much disconnection and omissions. Chapter 659. The fight begins. Do you really want to give these young people a chance? This battle is related to the fate of our American Republic. Kruger looked at Liang Zhao. The training cost and trial and error cost of these young people are too high. It is precisely because this battle is related to the fate of our country that I want to give them a chance. Liang Zhao put down the magnifying glass in his hand and said, Kruger, with only a few of us, we can only support the Republic for a while. The future will eventually depend on these young people. If we don't give them the opportunity to fight in actual combat, they will always be just paper talkers. Indeed, these fledgling young men in the staff department are too immature and extremely inexperienced, not to mention compared with those European staff officers, even if they are only compared with their North American counterparts in the Northern Federation and the Southern Alliance. The staff officers of the European army powers are more professional and have stronger business capabilities. With Liang Zhao's current strength and connections, he can also hire a group of excellent professional staff officers from Europe to provide him with intimate services. But this is undoubtedly exposing his underwear to the European powers, which Liang Zhao cannot accept in any way. Furthermore, if you just want to hire ready-made staff officers from other countries, you will never be able to train your own staff team. Therefore, Liang Zhao decided to give this precious training opportunity to his young men. He hoped that these young men could take out everything they learned in the military academy and give him a satisfactory answer. Your Excellency, President, your opinion is great. Seeing Liang Zhao's insistence, Kruger didn't know what to say. He had proposed to Liang Zhao many times, saying that he could hire a group of excellent officers from Prussia, including staff officers, to come to the United States to assist in the war, but these proposals were rejected by Liang Zhao. Who among these young staff officers is worthy of being reused? Liang Zhao asked Kruger. After taking office as president, Liang Zhao has shifted the focus of his work from military affairs to government affairs. He did not have as much contact with these young staff officers as Kruger, and naturally did not know them as well as Kruger did. As for talents that can be put to good use, there are none yet, Kruger said honestly. Among this group of young staff officers, the best performer is Lieutenant Colonel Pan Baolin. He is the best graduate of the Virginia Military Academy and has served in the 101st Infantry Regiment. He has the most extensive resume among this group of young people. Kruger has high standards. So far, he has not found any young talent among this group of young people who can impress him except Pan Baolin. Sir, the Vice President sent an urgent telegram. Presidential Assistant Zeiss received the urgent telegram from the telegraph room and hurried to Liang Zhao. The French Expeditionary Force has captured Mexico City, and French President Napoleon III will arrive in Jinshan soon for a state visit. It was expected that the French Expeditionary Force could capture Mexico City at lightning speed. Mexico has never been a military power, and the French army is a powerful land-armed force. It would be strange if the French Expeditionary Force could not capture Mexico City. Good news, great news. Liang Zhao was overjoyed when he learned that Napoleon III would arrive in Jinshan for an inspection visit. Telegram Fremont to welcome Napoleon III with the highest standard of reception. Be sure to receive this distinguished guest well. Napoleon III was not the first head of state to visit the American Republic. The first head of state to visit the American Republic was the King of Hawaii, but Napoleon III is the most important head of state to visit the American Republic so far. Since the announcement of the founding of the country, Liang Zhao has been unable to make a breakthrough at the diplomatic level. Although the Kingdom of Prussia recognized the American Republic and intended to establish formal diplomatic relations with the American Republic. However, Prussia also recognized the Northern Federation and the Southern Confederacy. As for the establishment of formal diplomatic relations promised by William I, it still remains verbal and has not been fulfilled. In 1861, France's voice in the international arena was obviously much more important than Prussia, and Napoleon III was much more important than William I. Furthermore, Prussia was still weak in 1861, and even if William I wanted to intervene in the Civil War in North America, he was powerless. If the situation could be opened from France, it would be the most important breakthrough since the establishment of the American Republic. Liang Zhao attached great importance to this visit of Napoleon III. I think you should go back to California to receive Napoleon III in person, so as not to make Napoleon III feel slighted, Sartre suggested to Liang Zhao. Sartre's suggestion was not unreasonable. The American Republic and the Second French Empire were countries of unequal size and strength. It was indeed disrespectful to let the Vice President of the American Republic come forward to receive the French Emperor. The war is imminent, and I can't leave North Platte, Liang Zhao said very decisively. He couldn't leave North Platte at such a critical moment. This army was brought up by him. As the founder and backbone of this army, his own stay or departure would have a huge impact on the morale of the soldiers on the front line. Considering this, Liang Zhao decided to stay on the front line decisively and not return to California. Napoleon III is currently only visiting California for inspection and has not yet officially confirmed the establishment of diplomatic relations with the American Republic. It is an extremely unwise choice to leave the front line to welcome Napoleon III at this time. Let my parents and my wife come out to welcome Napoleon III on my behalf, Liang Zhao added. Thinking that it was indeed inappropriate to let Fremont alone come out to welcome Napoleon III, he simply let his family who were still in California come out to welcome Napoleon III on his behalf to show his sincerity. After dealing with these things, Liang Zhao was a little tired and planned to take a nap to rest. Just as he walked into the lounge and lay down, he saw his cousin Liang Zhao running in anxiously, panting and saying, "No. No. Fighting. Fighting." Hearing that fighting had started, Liang Zhao was so shocked that he lost all his sleepiness and jumped out of bed. The Yankees started it first. Liang Zhao, who had just come back to his senses, could not hide his excitement and said excitedly. The troops on the North Platte front were already prepared for a big battle. And the mobilization work was basically completed. It can be said that they were fully prepared. At this juncture, Liang Zhao was eager for the Federal Army in the North to take action first, but Liang Zhao was confused because he did not hear any gunfire. Was there something wrong with his hearing? No, Liang Zhao took a breath and added, the newly recruited Taiping prisoners and the Solon Cavalry Battalion and the Mongolian Cavalry Regiment fought, and they couldn't stop them. The Taiping Army and the Solon Cavalry Battalion fought. Liang Zhao was very disappointed and angry. What do their officers do for a living? They can't even control their own men. Chapter 660, Not Using All Your Strength. West Camp is located west of North Platte City. According to the plan, 2,300 Taiping prisoners were to undergo the most basic training in West Camp. The three regular brigades of 101, 102, and 103 were responsible for selecting non-commissioned officers to train them. After the basic framework was built, they were reorganized into the Guangxi Regiment as a second-line force. Unexpectedly, the training work had just begun when an accident happened. About 1,000 people started fighting in West Camp, and the number of people participating in the fight was still increasing. Of course, the number of people who came to watch the excitement was also increasing rapidly. It was said that the military chiefs of both sides participated in the fight. Since the establishment of the Western Army, there has never been such a large-scale, fierce, and bad fight. In order to prevent the situation from deteriorating, the Machine Gun Regiment, the 1st Cavalry Regiment, formerly the Indian Cavalry Regiment, stationed in West Camp, and the 3rd Regiment of the 101st Brigade had to come forward to maintain order and form a human wall to separate the Taiping prisoners who tried to enter West Camp to participate in the fight, as well as other Solon camps and Mongolian Regiment cavalry. The head of the Machine Gun Regiment, Washington, took the tin trumpet handed over by the orderly and shouted loudly, "Stop it! Kikuti! Woology! These new recruits just came to North Platte and don't know the military rules. Don't you veterans who have been trained in North Platte for 2 years still don't know the military rules?" Washington hoped that the battalion commander of the Solon Cavalry Battalion and the head of the Mongolian Cavalry Regiment could take the lead and stop the fight. But the two sides were already red-eyed. Kikuti and Woology grabbed Zhu Yidian, whose hair was half-shaved, and wrestled with Pangashan. They were fighting hard, so how could they listen to Washington? The head of the 1st Cavalry Regiment was the Indian Mackwick, who was one of the first 2 Indian chiefs to join the California system. Mackwick didn't understand why Kikuti and Woology had such a big grudge with these recruits and had to fight in the barracks. But it must be said that these long-haired recruits were also quite capable. As cavalrymen, Mackwick had fought with the Solons and Mongolians on weekdays. The close combat skills of the Solons and Mongols, including hand-to-hand combat, locks, and wrestling, are first-rate, especially the Solons. Even if he attacks personally, it is difficult for him to gain an advantage. Washington. Stop your mother-in-law's noise in my ear. I'm going to teach these long-haired people a lesson today. Kikuti's powerful right fist hit Zhu Yidian's face. Zhuyidian also refused to give in, and stepped forward to protect Kikuti, not giving Kikuti space to display his skills. Qing Yao. I'm going to send you to hell now, beat them to death. These old long-haired people in Guangxi slaughtered the old long-haired people in Jiangning. Bah. You still have the nerve to say that. As for slaughtering the city, the blood on your hands is the blood that can never be washed clean. Only when Lin Fengxiang and Li Keifang failed to capture the demon cave in the capital during the northern expedition, they killed all the shaking heads in the demon cave in the capital, on the way to the west camp on horseback. Liang Zhao had already understood the ins and outs of the matter. It turned out that the non-commissioned officers who were transferred to the Taiping army prisoner camp were shaving the prisoners' hair and changing them into military uniforms today. These Taiping army prisoners were originally resistant to shaving their heads. However, after the Solin people learned about this, they brought the Mongols to watch the fun and tease the Taiping army prisoners who were shaving their heads. At first, the two sides only had some quarrels and sporadic conflicts, but they didn't expect that the matter would get bigger and bigger and turned into a large conflict involving thousands of people. Fortunately, neither side has used weapons so far. Friendly troops also came to control the situation, and the conflict did not spread further. President, you are finally here. Washington saw his brother-in-law coming and ran over to Liang Zhao to lead the horse as if he had seen a savior. The scene in front of him made Liang Zhao frown. He saw thousands of people fighting together, and the surrounding canvas tents, kerosene lamps and other things were all dismantled and became their weapons for fighting. The Taiping prisoners, Solin soldiers, and Mongolian soldiers who were blocked from the fighting circle and eager to squeeze into the fighting circle became obedient when they saw Liang Zhao and the presidential guard riding horses and whipping their whips. They dared not to continue to squeeze forward. Fire the cannon, Liang Zhao said to Washington. There were thousands of people fighting, and they would definitely not be able to stop if they shouted. Washington was a smart man and quickly understood Liang Zhao's intention. He pulled two 6-pound regimental Sacramento infantry guns from the 3rd Regiment of the 101st Brigade and fired 2 blanks on the spot. With 2 deafening bangs, the crowd who were fighting was finally shocked. Liang Zhao signaled Washington to take people to carry out all the senior officers involved in the fight. Soon, Washington led his soldiers to carry out the officers of the Solin Cavalry Battalion and the Mongolian Cavalry Battalion who were wearing blue-green military uniforms, with school officer collar badges and shoulder badges. As for the Taiping prisoners, since they had not yet formed an army, no one was awarded a military rank. Washington could only bring out Peng Dashan and Zhu Yidian, who he knew no merit, gathering a crowd to fight in the military camp. What a great skill, Liang Zhao said gloomily. His cold eyes swept over the culprits, and shouted sternly, "Take off their collar badges and epaulets." The guards around Liang Zhao stepped forward and took off the epaulets and collar badges of several Solin and Mongolian officers. These long-haired people call us Qing monsters. Kikuti was very unwilling to be stripped of his lieutenant colonel rank, which he had worn for only 2 months and was not even warm yet. Kikuti was a lieutenant colonel of the regular cavalry who had completed the training. He understood what it meant to be stripped of his rank. Even if he could continue to stay in the military camp afterwards, he could only start over as a private. You Qing demon, you still have the nerve to talk about us, aren't you the one who always calls us long-haired? Zhu Yidian saw Kikuti and others being stripped of their military ranks, and covered his swollen left eye and gloated. Don't be too happy too soon, you two, Liang Zhao scolded Zhu Yidian and Peng Dashan, you two have been with Liang Zhao for almost 2 years. The people below don't understand the military rules, don't you two understand them either? The original team of the Guangdong Braves was originally built by Liang Zhao's people. The military rules of the Guangdong Braves were largely borrowed from the Western Army. Moreover, gathering in the army to fight is a taboo in any army. Liang Zhao doesn't believe that these two people don't even understand this rule. The Guangdong brothers under Liang Zhao never called us long-haired to our faces, and there are not so many Tartars in the team, Zhu Yidian argued. Besides, the brothers don't understand why they had to shave their heads in the Qing demons, and they have to shave their heads here. Shaving heads when joining the army has been a rule since the establishment of our army, which is convenient for treatment. Liang Zhao took off his hat, revealing the green stubble on his head. It is not mandatory for civilians to shave their heads. Anyone who can't accept this rule and doesn't want to be a soldier can get out now. The American Republic has no rigid regulations on hair accessories. You can shave your hair or grow your hair as you like, But the Army has required short hair since the day it was established to facilitate care and treatment of head injuries. Peng Dechen, who was standing by, pulled Zhu Yidian's clothes and reminded him to say less. Zhu Yidian was speechless. The privates who had just served in the infantry company of the regular army could get $18 in salary every month. There was no deduction. They would get $18 in hand, or they would be directly issued gold coins. The treatment was better than that of the Guangdong warriors. These old brothers from Guangxi who were brought here had no other skills except fighting in battle. If they left the army and went to the civilian world, where they were unfamiliar with the place, where could they find a living of $18 a month? After much thought, staying in the army was the best choice. I know my crime. I am willing to be punished. Zhu Yidian and Peng Dechen knelt down to admit their crime. Thinking that Kikuti, Wulaji and others had already been punished, and shaving their heads was not directed at them, they felt much better and decided to stop while they were ahead. Get up. We can't kneel down here, Liang Zhao said gloomily. Those who participated in the fight this time will be dealt with according to military regulations. Clean up here. From now on, this will be the base for you and the Solon Cavalry Battalion and the Mongolian Cavalry Regiment. The punishment for private fighting in the National Defense Army of the American Republic is a confiscation of 3 months' salary for non-commissioned officers, and below, a confiscation of 6 months' salary for non-commissioned officers, and above, and a demotion of military rank. The punishment for gang fighting is much more severe, with a fine doubled and officers demoted by 2 levels. Of course, if someone is disabled, it will be handed over to the military court for judgment according to the specific circumstances. What? We have to live with these new recruits, Kikuti muttered in dissatisfaction. Obviously, he didn't want to live in the same room with these Guangxi soldiers who had new and old grudges. Zhu Yidian and Peng Dechen were also very unhappy to hear that they had to live with these Solon people and Mongolians, and see each other every day. However, they were new soldiers and had just caused a big disaster, so they didn't dare to say much, for fear that Liang Zhao would kick them out. If you don't like it, I'll take off your skin and get out of the barracks. Liang Zhao pointed at Kikuti's gray-green military uniform and scolded him. Not long after, Elvis came to the West Camp with the military police. Liang Zhao then handed over the aftermath to Elvis and his military police and left the West Camp. If you put the two groups together, aren't you afraid that they will fight again? Kruger still had some concerns after Liang Zhao left the West Camp. As a senior general of the American Republic, Kruger still maintained a relatively high level of attention to the outside world. He also knew about the grievances between the Taiping Army and the Qing Army. Kruger was worried that similar incidents would occur if the two groups of people were placed together. No weapons were used, and no one was killed, which shows that they still have some sense of proportion, and the hatred between them is not impossible to resolve, Liang Zhao said. Separating them from each other will deepen the prejudice. It is better to let them live under the same roof and enhance mutual understanding. If there is any trouble, just station another regular regiment next to the West Camp. The Taiping prisoners were not issued weapons, but the Solon Cavalry Battalion and the Mongolian Cavalry Regiment were regular cavalry units that had completed training and were equipped with complete weapons and equipment. No weapons were used, and no one was killed, which shows that these Solon and Mongolians still maintained their rationality and knew where the bottom line was. Otherwise, Liang Zhao would definitely deal with such a large-scale fight severely. The reason they fought was more because they disliked each other. Placing them together, seeing each other every day, over time, they naturally got to like each other. Will this affect our next military operation? Our troops are not sufficient to begin with. Kruger rode his horse closely behind Liang Zhao. We don't need to use all our strength to deal with Mason, our defeated general, Liang Zhao said calmly. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 661, Don't Talk If You Can't Agree. Mr. Blair, you keep saying that you are coming to negotiate with us with full sincerity. Sincerity is not just a lip service. The negotiators from the West and the North have been negotiating for some time, but have not made any substantial progress. Liang Zhao is tired of haggling with the representatives of the Northern Federation. In other words, he is ready now. If the Lincoln government is really sincere about peace talks and is willing to cede South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska, Liang Zhao is also willing to temporarily resolve the disputes in the Central Frontier through peace talks and use the saved military expenses to develop the Central Frontier. Unfortunately, he and Lincoln are both aware of the importance of the Central Frontier, and neither of them is willing to make concessions on the ownership of the Central Frontier. This is a core interest and there is no room for negotiation. Since they can't reach an agreement at the negotiation table, they can fight and talk at the same time. The situation currently faced by the American Republic is much better than that of the Northern Federation. The battlefield in the Central Frontier is far away from the West Coast, and the supply line is too long. This is a disadvantage, but also an advantage. At least no force can threaten the core area of the American Republic. In contrast, the situation Lincoln is facing now is much worse. The 70,000 Confederate troops led by three Confederates, Joseph E. Johnston, Pierre G. T. Beauregard, and Robert Lee, have assembled near Manassas. It is only a matter of time before they launch an attack on the Northern Army. The Southern Army is currently sitting still, and it is likely that they are watching the situation in the Central Frontier area, hoping that Liang Zhao and McClellan will start fighting first. Once the Central Frontier area starts fighting, Liang Zhao will contain McClellan's second batch of 100,000 mobilized troops, and the Southern Army will definitely take action. Although Davis is more indecisive than Lincoln, he is a political elite in the South after all. He is not stupid, but he is not courageous and decisive enough. He is not an outstanding politician. As an ordinary politician, Davis is still qualified. Our president and you have established a deep friendship very early on. I think you should know what kind of person he is. After being personally received by Liang Zhao, Montgomery Blair seemed to see hope and played the emotional card with Liang Zhao. The feelings between politicians are even less reliable than the love between a client and a prostitute. Liang Zhao and Lincoln had a good personal relationship. If they were not on different camps, Liang Zhao would be happy to make friends with Lincoln. He and Lincoln had many similar political ideas and views and had a lot in common. It is not easy to find a confidant in this era. Unfortunately, now that each of them has millions of people standing behind them who support them, their personal friendship can only give way to political positions. It is precisely because I know what kind of person Lincoln is that I know there is nothing to talk about between us. Liang Zhao sighed and murmured, politics is politics, and friendship is friendship. If Lincoln really wanted to resolve the dispute through negotiation, he would not have allowed McClellan to go south to occupy Kansas and Missouri and raid my flank. McClellan did not fail to support Mason's brigade guarding the Kearny Fort group, but McClellan did not directly send reinforcements to the forts. Instead, he led his troops into Kansas and Missouri, where the Confederate Army was relatively weak, and occupied most of the areas north of Kansas and Missouri with his superior numbers, threatening the Western Army on the flank. Then why did you let your negotiators contact us for so long? Blair could not help but mutter. This feeling of being seen through and used as a tool was not pleasant. Lincoln knows there is nothing to talk about between us, but he still sent you here, didn't he? Liang Zhao pointed out Blair's purpose. Go back and tell Lincoln that I hope we can have the chance to watch an opera together in the future. This is my personal gift to Lincoln. Please, as the Postmaster General, take it to Lincoln on the way. Zeiss brought a gift box that had been prepared long ago and handed it to Blair. Blair did not refuse. He was originally the Postmaster General, but he did not expect that he, as the Postmaster General, would also have the day to deliver mail in person. After Blair took the gift box, Zeiss ordered someone to bring out a few pieces of custom Idaho white porcelain and said to Blair, "Mr. Blair, I can't let you and your assistants make a wasted trip. These are gifts for you and your assistants. They are small gifts, not a token of respect. It seems that my job as a postman is not in vain. I also get errand fees." Blair laughed at himself, accepted the gift Liang Zhao gave him, and immediately said goodbye and left, boarding the special train to Washington. When he first met Liang Zhao, Blair felt that he had underestimated Liang Zhao. Although Liang Zhao was young, only 32 years old, he was more stable than some politicians in their 50s and 60s. Lincoln's worries were not unreasonable. Perhaps the West was a more formidable opponent than the South. Blair boarded his special train with gifts and returned to Washington to report. When his special train had just left the Union Army's outpost and was closest to Fort Goshen and North Platte, he heard a loud noise behind him. Blair and his companions stuck their heads out of the window to check the situation, only to see that a section of the track behind them had been blown up by a team of Union soldiers in blue uniforms. Blair's assistant was puzzled, Why did Fort Goshen's troops blow up the track? Blair couldn't help but twitch his mouth a few times and asked, which company does this section of the railway belong to? The Pacific Railway section west of Omaha belongs to the California Railway Company. The assistant thought for a while and said, the Pacific Railway is bounded by Omaha. The section east of Omaha belongs to Vanderbilt's New York Central Railway Company, and the section west of Omaha belongs to the California Railway Company. That is to say, what was destroyed just now were the assets of the West. Blair retracted his head, and he seemed to have figured out something. Those people were just wearing the uniforms of the Union Army. They may not be our Union Army. Although Nebraska was the focal point of the confrontation between the West and the North, the telegraph lines in the Nebraska area had always remained open. Mason and McClellan knew very well that this was Liang Zhao's deliberate act. Liang Zhao had enough cavalry, and there were also pro-Western Chinese people in the area. As long as Liang Zhao was willing, he could completely destroy the local telegraph lines and cut off the communication of the Northern Army. The news of the destruction of the Pacific Railway was quickly transmitted to Mason, who was stationed in Fort Kearny, and McClellan, who was stationed in Omaha, through the developed telegraph lines in Nebraska. McClellan's face was solemn when he heard the news, and he ordered all units to strengthen their vigilance to prevent the infiltration of the Western Army. Mason felt as if the sky was falling when he heard the news. As for the mysterious Northern Army cavalry unit that was rumored to have destroyed the railway, McClellan and Mason did not waste time to trace the origin of this unit. Although the Union Army had poor military discipline, no cavalry unit was bold enough to openly destroy the Pacific Railway section belonging to the California Railroad Company at this critical juncture. Chapter 662, Eastern Expedition. 1861. A loud noise on the Pacific Railway completely broke the calm situation in Nebraska and the deadlock in the entire North American continent. On the same day, Liang Zhao sent telegrams to the country and abroad, accusing the local Northern Federal garrison of deliberately destroying the property of the American Republic, and demanding that the Northern Federal Army withdraw all military personnel along the railway west of Omaha, including Omaha, within 72 hours and compensate for the losses. If the Federal Army does not withdraw from the Western Pacific Railway within 72 hours, out of self-defense and the need to protect the property of the citizens of the American Republic, the National Defense Army of the American Republic will have to counterattack in self-defense and demilitarize Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Kansas and other places. Lincoln was very surprised when he received the telegrams from Mason and McClellan from the front line. He thought that Liang Zhao would use troops in the central border area, but he did not expect Liang Zhao to find such a reason to send troops, and Liang Zhao's decisive attitude was also beyond Lincoln's expectations. It seems that Liang Zhao's control over the transportation capacity of the Pacific Railway and his ability to allocate resources in the entire western region are stronger than he expected. Lincoln knows Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao is a relatively cautious and stable person. He will not send troops without adequate preparation. Liang Zhao chose to send troops at this time, indicating that he has made sufficient reserves. Relying only on the Pacific Railway as a supply line to supply an armed force of more than 60,000 people, Liang Zhao is squeezing out all the transportation capacity of this railway to fight them, right? Lincoln secretly complained in his heart. The federal government almost did its best to barely provide the most basic supplies for the 80,000 troops in Omaha and the Kearny Fortress Group. The quality of the supplies is likely to be inferior to that of the Western Army in North Platte. According to the telegram that Blair sent back to Lincoln not long ago, the Western Army stationed in North Platte conducted high-intensity training every day without interruption, and the soldiers did not complain about it. In addition, the uniforms of the Western Army were very uniform, and even the militia had special uniforms, and the weapons they were equipped with were even better than those of the elite standing troops of the Federal Army. Thinking of this, Lincoln shuddered, and an inexplicable sense of fear rose up and rushed straight to his back. Although Lincoln was not a professional soldier, he had served as a militiaman and participated in low-intensity wars. He still had a little military common sense. Only with sufficient logistics support can high-intensity training be maintained. The officers and soldiers of the Western Army had no complaints about high-intensity training, which showed that this army was highly organized, morale-boosted, and well-trained. To be fair, it was much more difficult for Liang Zhao to maintain the logistics supply of North Platte than for Lincoln to maintain the logistics supply of Omaha. The length of the supply lines of the two and the difficulty of supply are not at the same level at all. Omaha can not only be supplied through the developed railway network in the central and eastern parts, but also allow the neighboring states of Illinois and Wisconsin to use traditional horse-drawn carriages to transport supplies to Omaha, although this is relatively inefficient. There is really no other way, and you can still get food on the spot in Omaha. Liang Zhao only had the Pacific Railway as his lifeline. Although Lincoln heard that Liang Zhao had achieved certain results in the reclamation and construction of the Platte Valley and parts of Colorado, this was only in the past 2 years. Lincoln did not think that only a few large strongholds in Colorado and these agricultural towns in the North Platte Valley could support a large-scale, well-equipped modern army. It seems that the Western Front is in danger. As for the Eastern Front, it was not much better. 70,000 Southern troops had assembled near Manassas, and the troops on the Eastern Front were also very tight. Lincoln did not have enough troops to withdraw to Omaha to support McClellan. Although he knew very well that the second batch of mobilized soldiers hastily organized by McClellan might not be the opponent of the Western Army, all he could do now was to pray to God, hoping that God would bless McClellan to hold Omaha for at least half a year. Holding Omaha for half a year was Lincoln's bottom line. The federal government had already started the third round of mobilization. As long as McClellan could hold the Western Army on the Omaha front for half a year, Washington would not be lost on the Eastern Front. By then, the initiative would be in their hands. What the federal government lacks most now is the reserve force that can be used. At present, all the soldiers that the federal government can use have been deployed to the front line. In terms of military, Lincoln has played all his cards and has no trump cards in his hand. Even so, Lincoln asked the presidential assistant Nickel to draft a harshly worded telegram to refute the rude request of the American Republic. Lincoln is not a pedantic person who does not know how to adapt. In fact, as a qualified politician, Lincoln is quite flexible. It is precisely because he is a qualified politician that Lincoln also knows more clearly what things can be flexible and what things cannot. The Central Frontier region is related to the core interests of the federal government and is also Lincoln's base. Based on this alone, Lincoln could not agree to Liang Zhao's tough demands and give up the Central Frontier region under the tyranny of the Western Army. Instead, he must firmly establish his foothold in the Central Frontier region. Otherwise, he cannot explain to the voters who lifted him to the presidency, let alone to the self-righteous members of Congress. Unable to explain to his superiors and subordinates, the only way for Abraham Lincoln was to step down. He didn't want to step down in such an undignified way. Moreover, after he stepped down, no one in the entire North would be able to clean up the mess. Who else but me can decide the fate of the Federation? Even if we are not sure of the Western Front, we must fight for it. Lincoln clenched his fists and said to his assistant Nickel decisively, "Nickel, send the telegram." Nickel looked at Lincoln, who was haggard and his eyes were still firm. Without saying much, he nodded slightly, took the telegram and went to the White House to pay for the telegram. Liang Zhao received a call back from Lincoln that night. On issues concerning core interests, Lincoln's position was still very clear and decisive. In this case, who can win the Central Frontier region can only be decided on the battlefield. The city of North Platte had already been under martial law and entered a wartime state. The next morning, the first batch of combat teams had already put on their equipment, checked their guns and ammunition, and assembled at the East Camp, ready to go, waiting for Liang Zhao's order to march eastward to make achievements. The first batch of troops to go east to participate in the war included the 102nd Brigade, the 103rd Brigade, the 1st Artillery Brigade, the 1st Cavalry Regiment, the Machine Gun Regiment, the Rocket Regiment, the California Militia Brigade, the Oregon Militia Brigade, the Utah Militia Brigade, and the local people, with a total number of more than 50,000. Liang Zhao mobilized 2/3 of his troops for this expedition. As the saying goes, there is no limit to 1,000 soldiers and no edge to 10,000 soldiers. Liang Zhao stood on the tower of North Platte and looked at the boundless and magnificent sea of people under his feet, and his heart was inevitably surging. This was the military force that he had spent a full 12 years to accumulate. Victory or defeat depends on this one move. Climbing up to the height and seeing the strong army he had built, Liang Zhao's eyes could not help but reveal a look of contempt for the world. Facing the rising sun in the east, Liang Zhao pulled out the saber that Napoleon III had given him, pointed it forward, as if he wanted to split the vast North American land in half. Liang Zhao took a deep breath and roared in the direction of Washington with the greatest lung capacity and voice in his life, "Go, go, go, go!" Under the tower, The soldiers who had been trapped in a corner of North Platte for more than 2 years had been holding back their energy. They responded to the tall and vigorous commander on the tower like a tsunami, vowing to break through the cage that trapped them today and drink from the Mississippi River. Go east. Along with Liang Zhao's roar, the artillery under the tower fired a salute, all the steamboats on the Platte River sounded their whistles, and the military musicians played military music to officially set out for the expedition. 50,000 troops lined up in neat rows, marching calmly and powerfully, pouring out of the North Platte fortress like a rising and falling human wave. It was like an unstoppable mountain torrent rushing down from the Rocky Mountains, with a momentum to submerge the entire Great Plains. The first to rush out of the North Platte fortress was the 1st Cavalry Regiment. The commander of the 1st Cavalry Regiment, Mackwick, led his cavalry to disperse in all directions, heading west and south, responsible for reconnaissance and police work to prevent the Northern Federal Army in Omaha and Kansas from raiding and supporting the Kearny Fortress Group. Although the comprehensive intelligence collected from all parties was judged, the possibility of the Northern Federal Army supporting the Kearny Fortress Group was very small. But if this expedition failed, it would cost a lot of gold and silver, and how many years it would take to gather such a strong army with such spirit and organization to go east. Therefore, even if there was a tiny possibility, Liang Zhao did not dare to take it lightly, because he could not wait. The Civil War was the best opportunity for him to expand his power to the Mississippi River Basin. Once the Civil War is over and the North completes the unification of the South, he will face an America with a settled state system, further awaken national spirit, and a relatively united America. By then, the difficulty of getting involved in the Mississippi River Basin will not be comparable to the current one. Following the 1st Cavalry Regiment is the 102nd Brigade, followed by the Artillery Brigade and the Rocket Regiment. The 102nd Brigade, the Artillery Brigade, and the Rocket Regiment are mainly responsible for the main attack force of the Kearny Fortress Group. The mission of the Oregon Militia Brigade and the Utah Militia Brigade is to provide cover for the main attack of the 102nd Brigade and the Artillery Brigade. The remaining 103rd Brigade, the California Militia Brigade, and the Machine Gun Regiment are used as reserves. Chapter 663, Kearny Fortress Group. The so-called Kearny Fort Group is composed of 5 star-shaped forts of different sizes along the Pacific Railway and the Platte River east of North Platte. In the final analysis, it is a variant of the Bastion. The 5 forts are Fort Goshen, Fort Cozad, Fort Lexington, Fort Kearny and Fort Grand from the nearest to the farthest from North Platte. Among them, Fort Goshen, Fort Cozad, and Fort Lexington are small and medium-sized forts, and Fort Kearny and Fort Grand are large forts. The defense system constructed by these 5 forts is called the Kearny Fort Group, and the command center is located in Fort Kearny. The 5 forts take advantage of the hilly terrain and are built on hills with high altitudes. They can overlook the Platte River and control the Platte River Waterway and the Pacific Railway. This is why the Western Army has been unable to take actual control of this section of the Pacific Railway from North Platte to Omaha, which clearly belongs to the California Railway Company. After the intensification of the conflict between the West and the North, the Northern Federation built the fort next to the railway and could cut off the railway at any time. Of course, this is why Liang Zhao had to fight this battle. The Pacific Railway is the lifeline of transportation connecting the East and the West. Without completely controlling this railway, there is no way to talk about immigration and development of the Great Plains. The 5 fortresses of the Kearny Fort Group are not located at a very high altitude, so it is impossible to be a one-man-to-one defense against 10,000 men. However, as long as the strategy is proper, the quality of the troops and weapons of the offensive and defensive sides is at the same level, it is still possible to be a one-man to 10-man-to-one defense against 10 men. There are 2 main types of fortresses in the United States. One is a coastal fortress. Coastal fortresses usually have walls 5 to 8 feet, about 1.5 to 2.5 meters, thick. The imaginary enemy of the coastal fortress at the beginning of its design was the powerful British Royal Navy, which needed to resist the bombardment from naval guns, especially the powerful 32-pound or larger caliber cannons at that time. Therefore, the walls of the coastal fortresses in the United States are usually very thick, and expensive, and hard bricks and stones are chosen as building materials. More than a month ago, Fort Sumter, which was attacked by the Confederate Army, was an expensive coastal fortress. To be fair, as far as Fort Sumter itself is concerned, the performance of the fortress is not bad, and it can even be called the conscience of the American civil engineering community. As a fortress that was not fully completed, Sumter withstood the bombardment of tens of thousands of shells, almost consuming all the shells in South Carolina's inventory. If it weren't for the good luck of the Confederate Army, one shot hit the ammunition depot of Fort Sumter. There is also a saying that Anderson set off the ammunition depot on Fort Sumter himself in order to surrender legitimately. Plus Anderson himself and his soldiers were in low morale and had no determination to defend Fort Sumter. The Confederate Army might not have been able to take down Fort Sumter, a half-finished sea fortress, so quickly. Fort McHenry, where the Northern Army was stationed to control the situation in Maryland, is also a typical coastal fortress in the United States. Another type of fortress is the inland fortress. The Kearny Fort Group, which the Western Army is now asking to attack, is a representative of the inland fortresses of the United States. Compared with coastal fortresses, the wall thickness of inland fortresses is relatively thinner, usually 2 to 5 feet, about 0.6 to 1.5 meters, because the imaginary enemies of the American inland fortresses are the native Indians and the Mexican and Canadian colonial armies. These imaginary enemies rarely have heavy weapons, so the walls of inland fortresses are only required to be able to withstand the bombardment of 12-pound artillery. Only a few important inland fortresses on the U.S.-Mexico and U.S.-Canada borders will have this design indicator raised to be able to withstand the bombardment of 24-pound heavy artillery. In terms of the choice of building materials, inland fortresses also choose civil engineering for cost-saving considerations. The three small forts of Goshen, Cozad, and Lexington use civil engineering as the building materials. According to the information obtained by Liang Zhao, the federal government has a plan to wrap the walls of all the fortresses in the Kearny Fort Group with bricks and stones, but it is limited by various objective reasons such as limited time, insufficient funds and manpower. Among the 5 forts in the Kearny Fortress Group, only Fort Kearny had its outer wall covered with bricks and stones. After all, the cost of building a brick and stone fortress in the central frontier area is several times that of a civil fortress. As for the introduction of iron, steel and concrete as building materials in large quantities for the reinforcement and construction of fortresses, it was not until the late Civil War at the earliest. The 3 small forts of Fort Goshen, Fort Cozad and Fort Lexington were very close and relatively easy to attack. Therefore, in the combat plan formulated by the General Staff, the first to be attacked were Fort Goshen, Fort Cozad and Fort Lexington. As small forts, Fort Goshen, Fort Cozad and Fort Lexington did not have many garrisons. Except for Fort Goshen, which was located at the forefront and had 3 companies of garrisons, Fort Cozad and Fort Lexington had only 2 companies of garrisons. The participating troops advanced by land and water, and each unit soon arrived at the designated location and began to set up camp. When Major Alex of Fort Goshen saw a large number of Western troops heading east, he was so scared that he quickly sent someone to the telegraph room to send a telegram to call for help. The Western troops who went east by train and boat were in a huge crowd, at least 30,000 to 40,000 people. With only 3 companies of troops under his command, it would be difficult to stop the main force of the Western Army, even if he occupied the advantageous terrain of Fort Goshen. Alex sent envoys to negotiate with the Western Army, issued a warning to the Western Army, stated that the Western Army had entered the federal territory, and demanded that the Western Army withdraw immediately. After the North and the West became enemies, a vague boundary spontaneously formed in the Nebraska region, which was roughly 20 kilometers east of Fort Goshen. Of course, this boundary was only a conventional boundary, and there was no explicit stipulation that this was the official boundary between the American Republic and the Northern Federation. The Western Army naturally ignored Alex's warnings and protests, and continued to do what it had to do and act according to the original plan. Seeing that the Western Army had already set up camp openly 6 or 7 kilometers away from Fort Goshen, Alex ordered the cannon to be fired as a warning after obtaining Mason's authorization. After only a few shells, the Western Army did not take it seriously at all. Instead, they set up the field artillery, calibrated the firing parameters, and slowly fired back 3 shots at the defenders of Fort Goshen. The last shot even hit the temporary earth embankment built outside Fort Goshen, smashing a big hole in the earth embankment. Now, the federal defenders in Fort Goshen finally obeyed. These 3 shots made Major Alex think that his eyes were dazzled for a while. He couldn't believe that this scene was real. The field artillery that fired at them just now was at least 5,000 yards, 4,600 meters, away from the earth embankment that was hit, and the opponent hit it easily. It's not that the Northern Federal Army does not have cannons with a range of 5,000 yards, but the Federal Army really does not have field artillery with a range of 5,000 yards. In addition to the exaggerated range, Alex was also impressed by the firing rate of the Western Army's artillery. Alex was an officer from the artillery, and he was sensitive to the performance parameters of artillery. Just now, the Western Army fired 3 shots in a row, which took only about 45 seconds. For heavy field artillery, this is an extremely exaggerated firing rate. Alex used the Napoleon cannon, 12-pound heavy smoothbore cannon howitzer, in his early years. The Napoleon cannon is still the main field artillery equipped by the Northern Federal Army and the Southern Confederate Army. The only difference is that there are more Napoleon cannons in the North, especially the number of Napoleon cannons is far more than that in the South. The Napoleon cannons equipped by the Southern Army are mainly 6-pound small Napoleon cannons, and heavy artillery is relatively scarce. According to Alex's past experience, the experienced Napoleon cannon crew can maintain a firing rate of about 2 rounds per minute under good combat conditions. But in a stressful combat environment, as the crew's physical strength is exhausted, its firing rate will soon drop to 1 round per minute. Being able to fire a stable rate of fire of 1 round per minute during wartime is already an elite artillery group of the Union Army. Alex has heard that the Sacramento guns used by the Western Army are extremely excellent, and there are no disadvantages except for the high cost and expensive shells. However, the Sacramento guns have always been equipped only in the artillery of the Western Army. No one in the Northern Union Army has ever seen or touched the Sacramento guns. In addition, there are many people in the Northern Union Army who think highly of themselves, and they look down on the Western Army from the bottom of their hearts. Therefore, most officers of the Northern Union Army lack attention to the Sacramento guns, and almost no one knows the specific performance parameters of this gun. They just think that the Western Army exaggerates the performance of their own guns and tries to sell their own guns to the War Department and Congress. Now it seems that the Western Army not only did not exaggerate the performance of their own guns, but was concealing the performance of their own guns. Alex thought this was extremely important intelligence. He quickly ran to the telegraph room and reported the situation to Brigadier General Mason at Fort Kearny. Chapter 664, The Federation's Secret Weapon. At Fort Kearny, 100 kilometers away from Fort Goshen, a batch of secret weapons of the Northern Confederacy arrived at Fort Kearny via the Pacific Railway. Brigadier General Mason, the supreme commander of the Kearny Fort Group, personally inspected this batch of secret weapons. He had gone to great lengths to obtain this batch of secret weapons from the War Department, using all his connections. Mason had high hopes for this batch of secret weapons. The Western Army was coming in full force, and in the current crisis, Mason did not think he had the ability to turn the tide and defend the Kearny Fort Group without reinforcements. In fact, Mason's goal was never to defend the Kearny Fort Group, but to delay the Western Army's eastward advance as much as possible, inflict the greatest degree of casualties on the Western Army, and dampen the Western Army's sharp edge. Mason knew very well that Lincoln and McClellan thought the same. McClellan's delay in sending reinforcements to the Kearny Fort Group was not entirely to avoid fighting, but to wait until the second batch of mobilized soldiers were trained and the supplies were in place before relying on the advantage of numbers to fight a decisive battle with the main force of the Western Army. Although McClellan's actions were reasonable and in line with Lincoln's strategic plan, Mason still felt very unhappy. No one wanted to be the pawn that was easily sacrificed. The most relied on weapon for guarding the fortress was undoubtedly the cannon. However, Mason knew that in terms of cannons, the standard cannons currently equipped by the Federal Army were not as good as the cannons of the Western Army. This was the conclusion drawn by Mason based on his own personal experience, and it could also be said to be a bloody lesson. 12 years ago, Mason, who was still a colonel in the Army, led his troops to attack California. At that time, he suffered a loss in front of the cannons of the California Regiment, the predecessor of the Western Army. At that time, the artillery of the Western Army was already using the rifled Napoleon cannon, which had an advantage in range. Mason still clearly remembered that the Western Army equipped with a Napoleon rifled cannon defeated his troops in Junction Bay. 12 years later, the armaments of the Northern Federal Army have not made much progress compared to 12 years ago. The large and small Napoleon cannons are still the mainstay of the Federal Army's field artillery. The fortress guns used in the defense of the Northern Union fortresses were mostly 24-pound and 32-pound smoothbore guns produced based on the technology of Napoleon's guns. Some important fortresses were equipped with 42-pound smoothbore guns. The situation of the Southern Confederacy was even worse than that of the Northern Union. After all, before the split, the Northern and Southern armies were under the same military system, and the equipment of the two armies was almost the same. Considering the weak military industry in the South, the Southern Union was inferior to the Northern Army in the field of artillery. Fort Kearny is one of the highest priority fortresses in the Federation. Fort Kearny is not only equipped with 24-pound, 32-pound, and 42-pound guns at the same time, but these fortress guns are all high-quality new guns. A few fortress guns have been modified and rifled, so they can be used as rifle guns, and there are enough shells and gunpowder. Fort Kearny, where Mason is located, is equipped with 128 fortress guns of various types, including 12 13-inch mortars. Even so, Mason still has no sense of security. It is rumored that the 12-pound Sacramento gun equipped by the Western Army Artillery has an effective range of an astonishing 4,000 yards. Mason does not know whether this is true or an exaggeration of the Western Army. After all, the range of the Napoleon gun of the same level is only 1,600 yards, about 1,460 meters. The improved rifled Napoleon gun has a significantly increased range compared to the traditional smoothbore gun, but its maximum range is only 2,000 to 2,500 yards, about 1,830 to 2,290 meters, which is still a long way from 4,000 yards. With the attitude of believing it is better to believe it than not, Mason still believes that the Western Army's artillery has a range of 4,000 yards, and prepares for defense based on this standard. According to this standard, the 128 fortress guns in Fort Kearny at this stage are undoubtedly a pile of scrap metal, and cannot gain an advantage in the confrontation with the Western Army artillery. Even though they were in a high position and had the advantage of terrain, they could increase the range of some fortress guns in disguise, but it was still difficult to close the performance gap between the two armies' artillery. The gap between 1,600 yards and 4,000 yards was too big to be closed by relying on a little terrain advantage. For this reason, Mason urgently needed a cannon with a range of 4,000 yards to guard his fortress. After learning that the West Point Arsenal in Coldwell, New York, had successfully trial-produced a cannon with a range of 4,500 yards, Mason was overjoyed and immediately asked the West Point Arsenal to manufacture a batch of new artillery and send it to the Kearny Fortress Group for actual combat testing. Now Mason can't care about whether the new artillery technology is mature or not, and how reliable it is. Considering the special status of the Kearny Fortress Group, the War Department also agreed to Mason's request and ordered the West Point Arsenal to work overtime to rush out a batch of new artillery and ammunition, which were delivered to the Kearny Fortress as soon as possible. The secret weapon that Mason had been waiting for was this batch of parent guns. The first batch of parent guns sent to Fort Kearny totaled 60 guns, including 30 30-pound parent guns with a caliber of 4.2 inches, 20 20-pound parent guns with a caliber of 3.67 inches, and the remaining 10 10-pound parent guns with a caliber of 2.9 inches. Not only 60 new parent guns were sent to Fort Kearny, but also artillerymen to operate these new guns. This was a very thoughtful consideration of the War Department. Perhaps it was because of his guilty conscience, or perhaps it was because the Western Army had already set out. Considering the relationship between the Kearny Fort Group and Omaha, McClellan was finally generous this time. With a wave of his hand, he allocated 2 militia regiments that had been trained to station with the artillery of the West Point Arsenal at Fort Kearny and handed them over to Mason for dispatch. The arrival of the long-awaited reinforcements and this batch of Patro artillery gave Mason more confidence, and he finally had some confidence. With more than 4,000 people and 200 cannons, even if Liang Zhao could finally take it, he would have to break several teeth, Mason thought. This was the best day since he entered the Kearny Fortress Group. The reinforcements he had been waiting for a long time finally came. Although the militia cannot be compared with a regular corps and volunteer corps, and it is not very useful in field battles, in the battle to defend the city, as long as the morale of the 2 regular regiments in his Kearny Fortress does not collapse, the gap between the militia and the regular corps and volunteer corps is not as big as in the field, and it is not impossible to use them. Therefore, Mason did not care too much that the reinforcements McClellan transferred to him were militias, and it was likely that they were second-line militias that McClellan, a stingy guy, looked down on, and Mason did not mind too much. You know, Mason had urged for a month before, but McClellan did not give him any support. This time, He was allocated 2 regiments at once, which was unprecedented. What else did he want? The Parrott gun is the first self-developed muzzle-loading rifled gun in my country. It uses special pointed bullets and has a maximum range of 4,500 yards, 4,100 meters. The Parrott gun not only has a long range, but also has a higher accuracy than the rifled Napoleon gun. Robert Parrott proudly introduced a gun named after him to Mason. He was full of confidence in the gun he had worked so hard to develop. Parrott was ambitious. He hoped that this gun could replace the Napoleon gun and become the standard gun of the Federal Army. Actual combat is the best advertisement. Parrott hoped that this gun would become famous in the Battle of Fort Kearny, and then be favored by the War Department and receive a steady stream of orders. Parrott is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, but unlike many of his colleagues, he did not serve in the Army after graduating from the military academy. Instead, he relied on his talent in the field of ordnance manufacturing to enter the West Point arsenal and became the director of ordnance. If the Parrott gun can become famous in this battle, Parrott will not only have a good chance of becoming the director of the West Point arsenal, calling on more resources to give his technical talents more practical space, but he will also become one of the leading figures in the American military industry. During the years as the director of ordnance at the West Point arsenal, Parrott has long grown from a relatively pure technical talent to compound talent, no longer just an engineer who only knows technology. The Parrott gun can indeed reach an ultra-long range of 4,500 yards, but a more accurate and rigorous statement is that the 30-pound Parrott gun can reach a range of 4,500 yards when using special pointed bullets and the maximum charge. The range of the 10-pound Parrott gun is only about 2,000 yards, about 1,830 meters, and the range of the 20-pound Parrott gun is about 4,000 yards, about 3,700 meters. 4,500 yards. Mason rubbed his hands excitedly, and it was obvious that he was very satisfied with this range. However, several artillery officers around Mason were skeptical about the data provided by Parrott. Mason also knew the nature of these arms dealers, who liked to exaggerate the performance of their products. But Parrott personally sent this batch of guns to Fort Kearny, which showed that Parrott was still very confident in his products. At least the maximum caliber 30-pound gun could reach a range of 4,500 yards. It is rumored that the range of the large caliber Sacramento gun is 4,000 yards. The maximum effective range of the Parrott gun of 4,500 yards is definitely enough in the fortress defense war. Seeing that Mason and several officers around Mason were skeptical about his words, Parrott did not say much. Facts speak louder than words, so they prepared to fire a few shots to open the eyes of Mason and several officers around him. The 30-pound Parrott cannon was an absolute heavy cannon, and the weight of the cast iron barrel alone reached an astonishing 4,200 pounds, about 1,905 kilograms. Fortunately, Mason had already prepared a pulley crane to welcome the arrival of this batch of heavy cannons. After a lot of effort, they finally lifted the heavy cannon onto the thick and solid fort wall of Fort Kearny and set up the cannon with all their hands and feet. After the heavy cannon was set up, Parrott directed a gun crew to adjust the elevation angle to 38 degrees. After the ammunition was loaded, Parrott personally fired the 30-pound heavy cannon. Mason and his group of officers had already raised their telescopes and observed the landing point of the shells with anticipation. Chapter 665, The Western Army's Artillery Fire is Fierce and Accurate. 4,600 yards, it must be more than 4,600 yards, it's already past that linden tree, at least 4,700 yards, at least 5,000 yards. The shells have all landed in the middle of the Platte River. A few seconds later, the shells landed, and a group of officers on the fort wall discussed the distance of the shells' landing points based on reference points. Although the specific distances were different, they all agreed on one point, that is, the distance of the shells' landing points must be far more than the 4,500 yards that Parrott had advertised to them. Mason also smiled, and his smile was as bright as a chrysanthemum blooming in autumn. Except for the slower firing rate, the performance of the Parrott gun in other aspects has exceeded Mason's psychological expectations, and he is very satisfied with the performance of the Parrott gun. Sir, a telegram from Major Alex. Mason's smile did not last long, and the signalman who came from the telegraph fort handed Mason the telegram from Major Alex of Fort Goshen. After seeing the contents of the telegram, Mason's chrysanthemum-like smile suddenly disappeared without a trace. A field gun with a range of 5,000 yards and a firing rate of at least 4 rounds per minute? Are you kidding? Parrott was the first to notice the change in Mason's expression. Parrott thought that Mason was dissatisfied with his gun, so he stepped forward and asked, "Your Excellency, please give us any suggestions. We can make improvements in the next batch. After all, this is a new product, and it is inevitable that there will be defects." Parrott really hoped that the artillery he designed and supervised could replace the Napoleon gun and become the standard artillery of the Federal Army. He was very happy to accept the opinions of the frontline officers and soldiers. "Please look, Your Excellency, you are an expert in artillery. Do you think this is possible?" Mason handed the telegram in his hand to Parrott. After reading the telegram, Parrott was also stunned, and his mouth was open enough to fit a whole goose egg. Impossible, absolutely impossible. Parrott was unwilling to believe that the performance of the cannon he had spent many years of hard work on was not as good as the old cannon that had been in service in the Western Army a few years ago. Maybe Major Alex was dazzled by nervousness? You know, people are most likely to make mistakes when they are nervous, even if they are obvious and low-level mistakes. Parrott found such a reason. It was not that he was unwilling to accept the reality, but the data of the Sacramento gun provided in the telegram was too shocking and unbelievable. Parrott had always wanted to disassemble a Sacramento gun for research, but the Western Army had always kept the Sacramento gun very secret, and the price quoted by the Sacramento arsenal was also very high. The War Department, which even thought the Napoleon gun was too expensive, naturally had little interest in the expensive Sacramento gun. Therefore, Parrott has not been able to see the true appearance of the Sacramento gun with his own eyes. He only knew that the Sacramento gun was a breech-loading rifle gun, and he knew nothing else. Do other countries have similar artillery? Mason's mood was complicated at this time. He was unwilling to believe that the Western Army's field artillery could reach an exaggerated range of 5,000 yards, but Mason knew Alex's character. Alex was a relatively upright professional soldier and would never lie to him about such an important matter. "I haven't heard of it," Parrott thought for a long time and said, "The British seem to have developed a breech-loading rifle gun with good performance last year, but the data circulated is not as exaggerated as the Sacramento gun. If the field gun produced by the Sacramento arsenal can maintain a firing rate of 4 minutes per minute while reaching a range of 5,000 yards, there is no doubt that it will be the most advanced artillery in the world. The Sacramento arsenal's design of artillery and their metallurgical technology will also reach a height that we can hardly reach." Parrott did not say it firmly. Emotionally, he did not want his opponent to have such a powerful weapon, but technically speaking, it was not completely impossible. The progress of American smelting technology in the past 20 years is obvious to all. Under such circumstances, the update and development of American weapons is still stagnant. To a large extent, it is not a technical problem, but there is no demand and motivation to develop more advanced weapons. After all, America does not have much national defense pressure, and the military expenditure given by the War Department is also very limited. Of course, the West is an exception. In the past 10 years, the West has been a breath of fresh air in America. The thirst for new weapons and new technology seems endless and regardless of cost. That is to say, this possibility is not ruled out, Mason murmured to himself. "Sir, I have a request. If you can seize a Sacramento cannon, please tell me and I will send someone to get it." Parrott made a request to Mason. From Fort Gosson to Fort Lexington, the American Republic has launched an artillery attack on the Federal Army that refused to surrender, and the earth-shaking artillery sound is endless. The 1st Artillery Brigade was split into 3 regiments, each responsible for bombarding a Union Army fort. Fort Gosson, Fort Zuccode, and Fort Lexington were all small forts. Whether they were strong or not was beyond question given the limited funds. In terms of firepower, the firepower of the 3 small forts, Fort Gosson, Fort Zuccode, and Fort Lexington, was relatively weak, and the fortress artillery positions of the 3 forts did not exceed 40 guns. The 1st Artillery Brigade was the only brigade-level artillery unit in the Western Army. It had 3 artillery regiments under its command, and 4 battalions under the regiment. 2 of the battalions were field artillery battalions equipped with 12-pound Sacramento field guns, and the main equipment of the other 2 heavy artillery battalions was 20-pound and 30-pound Sacramento heavy guns. The unit below the artillery battalion was the artillery company, and each battalion had 4 artillery companies under its command. Like the Northern Union Army and the Southern Confederate Army, the basic combat unit of the Western Army artillery was also the artillery company. The difference was that the Western Army Artillery Company had more people and equipment than the artillery companies of the Northern and Southern armies. The Union Army generally has 6 artillery groups and 1 artillery company. Due to the shortage of artillery, the Confederate Army reduced the number of artillery groups to 4 per artillery company. The Western Army's artillery company is the most generously equipped, with 8 artillery groups, which is exactly twice the number of the Confederate Army's artillery company. At Fort Goshen, the torn stars and stripes fluttered in the wind, swaying. Major. The artillery fire of the Western Army is too damn fierce. A Union Army second lieutenant covered his eardrums and almost broke his ears and shouted to Major Alex, the military director of Fort Goshen. It's not just fierce. It's fierce and accurate. We have a total of 37 artillery positions, and 16 of them were damaged by the Western Army. A Union Army lieutenant crawled into the cellar and found Major Alex curled up in the cellar. After 7 hours of uninterrupted artillery bombardment by the Western Army, their uniforms had long been smoked black and gray by the smoke. Go to the warehouse and drag out the spare artillery. Hoist it up. Fire back after it's installed, Major Alex yelled at the lieutenant and gave orders. As a frontline fortress, Fort Goshen had done sufficient preparations for war, and there were spare artillery in the warehouse. After being bombed for a full 7 hours, Alex was a little dazed. What kind of artillery is the Western Army equipped with? It's the first time since the founding of the country that field artillery can suppress fortress artillery. When Alex's father participated in the Second War of Independence, the British Army was powerful enough, but the British field artillery was not able to suppress American fortresses. We can't fight back, Major. Our broken Napoleon cannons can't reach the Western Army's artillery. The face of the Northern Army lieutenant who answered was full of fatigue and fear, and his eyes were unfocused. He no longer had a determination to continue fighting, only endless fatigue and confusion. The bombardment of the Western Army showed no signs of weakening. What echoed in the ears of these officers was not only the rumbling of the artillery, but also the painful wails of their comrades and the muffled sound of the soldiers falling to the ground. The rain of artillery fire from the Western Army had shattered their will to resist. All the officers present had realized that no matter how much they resisted, it would be futile and there was no need to make fearless sacrifices. Even if they chose to be responsible for executing Alex's orders at this time, no soldier was willing to risk the bombardment of the Western Army to hoist the spare artillery in the warehouse to the gun position on the wall. Besides, what's the point of hoisting those Napoleon cannons up? Fire 2 shots to let the Western Army hear the sound, and then wait to be destroyed by the Western Army again? Wait a little longer, it will be dark in an hour. After dark, the Western Army will definitely stop the bombardment. Then we can take a breath and hoist the cannon up. Alex opened his pocket watch, looked at the time displayed on the pocket watch and said, according to the bombardment method of the Western Army, even if people can bear it, the artillery can't. Holding on until dark and waiting for the Western Army to stop bombarding after dark is Alex's only hope now, or it can be said to be a luxury. Alex is not unwilling to surrender and want to live and die with Gossenberg. Even if he has this idea, the group of soldiers under his command who earn $9 a month will not follow him to the end, even though many of these soldiers are his fellow countrymen. Alex has never considered whether to surrender or not. But when to surrender? Of course, this surrender time cannot be today. Surrendering on the first day of the war is too shameful. At least he must hold on until the second day before surrendering. Chapter 666 Consumables. At 7:30 in the evening, the frontline headquarters outside Fort Goshen received telegrams of surrender from the defenders of Fort Zagat and Fort Lexington. The commander of the artillery brigade, Sutter, felt unsatisfied. The defenders of Zagat and Lexington surrendered immediately? I want to use them to practice with the 2nd and 3rd artillery regiments. There are not many such good opportunities for actual combat shooting. Sutter did not want the defenders of these forts to surrender too early. The 1st Artillery Regiment was expanded from a regiment to a brigade, absorbing many new recruits. These new recruits lacked actual combat experience. Sutter wanted to use these 3 small forts for the new recruits to practice. Pouring 38,000 shells into a palm-sized fort in one day, even if it doesn't kill many people, it will scare the Northern Army in the fort. Kruger couldn't help laughing and said, "You have used up a quarter of the life of a cannon in one day. According to your way of fighting, a cannon can only last you 3 days." Kruger had never fought such a rich war in the Prussian army in his early years. In a small battle, at least 110,000 shells were consumed in just one day. Such an intensity of artillery fire was not something that the American army, not to mention the elite troops in Europe, could withstand. Kruger's statement that he used up 1/3 of the life of a cannon in one day was not an exaggeration. The service life of each Socrato cannon was 1,200 rounds. Each cannon fired 300 rounds a day. At this intensity, a cannon could only be used for 4 days. In a high-intensity war, not only ammunition is a consumable, but the guns themselves are also consumables. When the cannon goes off, it's worth a fortune. Today, the ammunition alone cost $420,000. Elvis lamented how fast the war was burning money, and that didn't even include the loss of artillery and the food for more than 40,000 people. If the shells produced are not fired, are they kept for the new year? Sartre laughed. Are there any casualties in Tycoon and Lexington? Liang Zhao walked out of the lounge of the frontline headquarters slowly, stretched his waist and asked. The Kearney Fortress Group was just an appetizer, and the 3 small forts of Goshen, Tycoon and Lexington were just appetizers among appetizers. The surrender of the 2 small forts did not cause any waves in his heart. His real target was the main force of the Federal Army gathered in Omaha. As for how much money was spent today, Liang Zhao didn't care. It was just a matter of a few $100,000 and selling more kerosene to Europe. Their guns can't reach us, so how can there be casualties? Sartre said with a relaxed look. It's just that the results are a little small. Only 327 prisoners were captured, and the highest rank is only a major. Shouldn't there be 2 majors? Elvis asked. He had just finished drinking black tea and returned to the headquarters. He had not had time to check the telegrams sent back from the front line. The highest military commanders of the 3 small forts of Goshen, Tycoon and Lexington were all majors. The 2 small forts surrendered, and only 1 major was captured. Did the remaining 1 run away or die? Major Charlie of Fort Lexington was killed in the explosion. Sartre said, if you want to get 2 major prisoners, I will let the 1st Artillery Regiment increase the intensity of the artillery and blow up the major of Fort Goshen to surrender. There were no casualties. Liang Zhao was very satisfied with this result. He didn't care about spending more money on shells. Compared with the money for shells, he was more worried about too many casualties. The soldiers who followed him to the east this time were all veterans, and 1 less death was 1 less. As for the subsequent supply problems caused by the excessive consumption of ammunition, Liang Zhao is not worried at this stage. At present, the battle line has not been opened, the supply line is very short, and the battle is along the Platte River and the Pacific Railway, so it is relatively easy to supply ammunition. The Rocket Regiment has not been trained yet. Let's give the Rocket Regiment a chance to show off. Liang Zhao wanted to play with some rockets to open his eyes. The Rocket Regiment officers and soldiers, who had been eager to try, quickly pushed the rocket car forward after receiving the attack order to make the final preparations before launching. The rocket equipped by the Rocket Regiment is based on the improvement of the Congreve rocket, named Cheyenne-Fa. Cheyenne-Fa rockets are divided into light and heavy types, with light rockets below 32 pounds and heavy rockets above 32 pounds, inclusive. Light rockets are mainly used for field operations, while heavy rockets are mainly used for sieges or naval battles. Having said that, the 32-pound rocket is more often used as a medium-sized rocket that can be used for naval battles or field operations. It is also the type of rocket equipped with the largest number of rockets in the Rocket Regiment. The 32-pound Sky Punishment rocket is large in size and weight, so it needs to be launched using a special launch vehicle. Each rocket launch vehicle has a crew of 8 people, with a specific personnel configuration as follows: 1 captain and 1 deputy captain. The captain's duties are to aim at the target and command the launch, while the deputy captain's duties are to assist the captain and replace the captain when the captain is injured or killed. 2 rocket loaders are responsible for installing the rocket on the launch track and ensuring that the rocket is in the correct position. 1 igniter is responsible for igniting the rocket fuse and launching it. 2 ammunition carriers are responsible for carrying ammunition. 1 maintainer is responsible for the maintenance of the launch vehicle and the rocket. Soon, under the command and dispatch of the Rocket Regiment leader Liang Zhao, 80 rocket launchers were ready. Ignite, with Liang Zhao's order. Hundreds of rockets gradually pierced the night sky, dragging scarlet tail flames, mixed with a unique scream of rockets, like an angry dragon out of the sea, rushing straight to the Goshen fortress. A few seconds later, the rockets landed, and the deafening explosion shook the earth. The flames soared into the sky, instantly engulfing the walls and trenches in the fortress. For a time, the entire Gaussian fortress was filled with smoke and rubble. Although the rockets of this era were not very accurate, it did not require great accuracy to hit a target as large as a fortress. Almost all the punishment rockets were launched into the Gaussian fortress. With only one round of rocket salvos, the defenders in the Gaussian fortress were frightened and their morale completely collapsed. To be fair, since most of the defenders in the Gaussian fortress were hiding in the bunker cellar, a round of rocket salvos caused very limited casualties to the defenders. But this round of rocket salvos had a much greater impact on the morale of the defenders than the daytime bombardment. Raise the white flag. Raise the white flag. Surrender. Surrender. We surrender. Alex held his head and ordered his lieutenants to raise the white flag and surrender to the Western Army. At this moment, he no longer had the idea of holding on until the next day to surrender and save some dignity for himself. Who knows how many more rounds of beatings they will have to endure tonight. In less than a quarter of an hour, the remaining 158 Northern Army soldiers in Fort Gaussen held white flags and walked out of Fort Gaussen and surrendered to the Western Army. So far, the three small and medium-sized forts of Fort Gaussen, Fort Cozad, and Fort Lexington have all been occupied by the National Defense Army of the Republic of America, and the first phase of the campaign goal of the National Defense Army of the Republic of America has been completed. In this battle, the National Defense Army of the Republic of America took only one day to capture the three small and medium-sized forts built by the Northern Federation at a heavy price without any casualties, captured 485 Northern Army soldiers, and killed 261 Northern Army soldiers. Liang Zhao and the top leaders of the National Defense Army were very satisfied with this performance. To be able to withstand such heavy casualties, the defenders of these three forts should be the elite of the Northern Army. Although this victory came easily, Liang Zhao still gave his opponent a relatively objective evaluation. To be honest, the performance of these Northern Union troops was not bad, but it was a pity that they met an opponent like him who was not afraid of spending money in a war. If the opponent was the Southern Army, these Northern Union troops might be able to hold on for a month or two. It has been examined. They are all from the Mason Brigade, the standing army before the war, Liang Zhao reported to Liang Zhao very excitedly. The Northern Union Army has three levels. The first level is the standing army that existed before the war. This batch of Northern troops is not large in number, only tens of thousands of people, but it is the most powerful team in the Northern Union. The second level is the Volunteer Corps formed by the Northern states. The source of the Volunteer Corps is mainly composed of retired soldiers. The combat effectiveness is also very strong, but the number is not large. The third level is the first and second batches of mobilized soldiers. The origins and composition of these mobilized soldiers are relatively complicated. Most of them are urban poor and bankrupt small farmers. The mobilized soldiers are currently the largest and weakest troops in the Northern Army. Killing and capturing 746 standing troops of the Northern Union in the first battle is indeed a big victory. The news that Fort Gaussen, Fort Cozad, and Fort Lexington had been lost, and 746 regular soldiers of the Northern Union from the Mason Brigade had been killed and captured, quickly spread along the developed telegraph network in North America to the West Coast, as well as Washington and Richmond. Although they had been mentally prepared before, the fact that the three forts could not stop the Western Army for even a day was still far beyond the expectations of the Lincoln cabinet. How many casualties did the Western Army suffer? Secretary of State Seward asked Secretary of War Scott. If the Western Army suffered relatively heavy casualties to capture the three forts, such a result would not be unacceptable. We cannot count the casualties of the Western Army, but the Western Army has publicized that they have no casualties. The only casualties are the ammunition in their North Platte ammunition depot and the US dollars in the treasury. Scott's face was like a Shar-Pei dog, and there was no expression fluctuation on his face. Nonsense, Seward retorted, these Western barbarians are so shameless. How could they take down three fortresses without any casualties? The ones defending these three fortresses are our standing army. Standing army, Seward had serious doubts about this result. Offensive battles are the most difficult battles to fight. The Western Army took down their three fortresses at lightning speed without any casualties, which in itself violated the common sense of war. The American Army is a modern army, not a primitive Indian armed force or a medieval army. How could it not pay any casualties? Anyway, at least one thing is certain. The Western Army took down the three forts guarded by our standing army in less than 12 hours. Lincoln frowned. We have to keep the situation confidential. At present, it seems that our third batch of mobilized soldiers will only mobilize 100,000 people. This mobilization number is still too conservative. Chapter 667 Bull Creek. Since the North had a huge advantage in active military forces, manpower, and industrial capacity, everyone from Congress to newspapers, from civilians to the military, urged Lincoln to take the initiative and fight quickly. There was even a voice in Congress to dismiss McClellan, who was passive in fighting, and to choose a general with a stronger ambition and a more positive attitude to replace McClellan as the commander-in-chief of the Western Front. If the news that the Western Army had captured 3 forts in one day spread, it would inevitably arouse greater public opinion. The troops on the Western Front were required to take the initiative to fight and wash away the humiliating defeat of the loss of Fort Goshen, Fort Cozad, and Fort Lexington. If they really had to take the initiative, the situation would become even worse. Mason's brigade's regular army still suffered a disastrous defeat while shrinking in the defense of the fort. Could it be that the main force under McClellan, which was mainly composed of mobilized soldiers, and the elite of the Western Army could defeat the Western Army in a field battle? In any case, Lincoln must suppress this news at present. As for how long this news can be suppressed, it depends on God's will. The next 2 forts that the Western Army was going to attack were Fort Kearny and Fort Grande. Lincoln hoped that the defense battles of these 2 large forts could be fought more beautifully, so that he could also promote the Northern Army on the Western Front and boost the morale of the Northern soldiers and civilians. Increase the number of the third batch of mobilized soldiers by another 50,000, Scott proposed. Scott was in favor of continuing to increase the number of mobilized soldiers. Since they could not win by quality, the only way left for the Northern Federal Army was to win by quantity. In terms of manpower, even if they had to compete with the West and the South at the same time, the North could still afford it and spend time on it. Yesterday's battle had already shown that the Western Army was so elite that even the Federal regular troops could hardly match it. Scott also did not believe that the Western Army could take down the 3 forts held by the Federal regular troops at the cost of 0 casualties, but the Western Army's top brass dared to publicize it like this, so it was believed that the casualties of the Western Army would not be too great. So far, we have mobilized 300,000 mobilized soldiers, and the Ministry of Finance is already overwhelmed. Should we delay the increase in the number of mobilized soldiers? Federal Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase could not help but roll his eyes at Scott. Scott, the old man, wanted to add 50,000 more conscripts in one sentence. Do you know how much it costs to mobilize one more conscript? A full $16. That's just the mobilization cost, not including the subsequent cost of supporting one conscript. The war situation is critical. This matter must not be delayed. The Western Army won the first battle, and the South will probably take action soon, Lincoln said worriedly. The front line between the Western Army and the Northern Army was the Platte River, and the front line between the Southern Army and the Northern Army was Bull Creek. Bull Creek is a tributary of the Potomac River, running from northwest to southeast. Before the war, Bull Creek was just an ordinary, unknown stream with an average width of about 12 to 13 meters and an average depth of only 2 to 3 meters. There are thousands of ordinary streams like this in the United States. However, after the South declared its secession from the Union, the strategic value of this stream between the northern capital Washington and the southern capital Richmond rose sharply. Generals from both the North and the South saw the strategic value of this stream and deployed heavy troops on both sides of Bull Creek. The front-line headquarters of the Confederate Army was located in the town of Manassas on the south bank of Bull Creek, and the front-line headquarters of the Union Army was located in the town of Centerville on the north bank. The main force of the Confederate Army on the Bull Creek front was General Beauregard's Army of the Potomac. The Army of the Potomac was one of the first troops of the Confederate Army to complete its preparation. It had 8 infantry brigades, 2 artillery brigades, and a Virginia cavalry regiment, stationed in the town of Manassas. The total force was about 33,000 people. The brigade-level unit organization of the Confederate Army was quite different from that of the Western Army. A standing brigade of the Western Army had 7,500 people at full strength, and was equipped with a brigade artillery battalion, a regimental artillery company, a machine gun company, an engineer company, a reconnaissance company, a communications company, and a few cavalry units. It could fight independently without the support of professional artillery units and was a heavy composite brigade of this era. The number of people in a brigade of the Confederate Army was only 2,000 to 4,000, and it was a pure infantry brigade. As for the artillery brigade of the Confederate Army, The gap between it and the artillery brigade of the Western Army was even greater. The Confederate artillery brigade was usually composed of 3 to 5 artillery companies, each equipped with 4 6-pound or 12-pound Napoleon guns, and a brigade could only hold 20 guns at most. The firepower of a field artillery battalion of the Western Army was stronger than that of the Confederate artillery brigade. The 6-pound gun, which the Confederate Army regarded as heavy firepower, had been transferred to the Regimental Artillery Company by the Western Army and used as support firepower at the regimental level. Fortunately, it was the early stage of the war, and the Confederate Army had sufficient mules, horses and ammunition. The disadvantages of the Confederate and Union artillery were not so great that they could not even fight back on the front battlefield. In addition to the town of Manassas, the Confederate Army also deployed the Shenandoah Corps in the Shenandoah River Valley, which was commanded by Confederate General Johnston. The Shenandoah Army consisted of 4 brigades, namely the Bartow Brigade, the Jackson Brigade, the B Brigade, the Smith Brigade, and a Virginia Cavalry Regiment, Stuart Cavalry Regiment, totaling more than 23,000 people. The Confederate Army also had a special unit stationed in Manassas. This unit, Texas, supported the Confederate Army in the name of civilian armed forces. Although the unit was called the Texas Volunteer Brigade, it had only 2 regiments, 1 artillery regiment and 1 Japanese mercenary regiment, with a total of 2,200 people. Although the Texas Brigade was small in number, its artillery regiment had the heavy firepower that the Confederate Army dreamed of. 24-pound heavy artillery. The Western Army has officially declared war on the Northern Army, and our president is still indifferent to this. Do we have to rely on the Western Army to fight a war of independence for us? Robert Lee, the commander-in-chief of the Confederate Army, who learned that the Western Army had made a breakthrough in the Platte River Valley at the Confederate Army's frontline headquarters in Manassas, could no longer sit still. Telegram after telegram was sent to Richmond, and the telegraph machine was about to send out sparks, but the Southern President Davis and his cabinet remained indifferent. In terms of strategic decision-making, the decision-makers in the North and the West were very radical. The Lincoln government would rather risk fighting on 2 fronts than give up the central frontier region. The Liang Zhao government could have stayed in the Platte Valley, but it chose to send its elite troops eastward. In contrast, the performance of the Southern decision-makers was extremely conservative. They were only satisfied with enjoying the established fact of independence, and did not make progress. They pinned their hopes on diplomatic recognition from Britain and France. It is true that the conservative policy of the South was caused by objective factors such as manpower shortage and weak industry. But Robert Lee still believed that Davis and his cabinet were too conservative and too naive. Not to mention that it was difficult for the Southern regime to obtain recognition and substantive support from Britain and France at the same time, even if Britain and France recognized the legitimacy of the Southern regime and were willing to establish formal diplomatic relations with the South. Would the North give up using troops against the South? The legitimacy of the Lincoln government came from abolition, and he himself was also an extremely ambitious person. No matter what achievements the South made in diplomacy, the Lincoln government, the Republican Party, and even the Northern Democratic Party would not give up their claims to the Southern territory. Instead of waiting for the North to mobilize soldiers and march south after the coup, it would be better to take advantage of the unstable position of the Northern Army and march north to defeat the main force of the Northern Army on the Eastern Front, forcing the Lincoln government to sign a humiliating treaty in Washington. According to the intelligence that Ms. Rose asked the Sparrows to pass down, now is indeed the best time for us to take the initiative. Davis's style made Beauregard, a conservative, feel too conservative. Beauregard also believed that now was the best time to attack North. Once the North and the West reached a compromise, their situation in the South would be dangerous. Ms. Rose was a Northern socialite who sympathized with the South and maintained an ambiguous relationship with many Northern congressmen. Long before the South declared independence, Rose and many Northerners who sympathized with the South had delivered a lot of very valuable intelligence to the man. The so-called Sparrow is the messenger who conveys intelligence from the North to the man. In the early days of the war, the South's intelligence work was much better than that of the North. Thanks to the intelligence support from these Northern sympathizers, Robert Lee and Beauregard knew the deployment of the Union Army north of Bull Run very well. Therefore, they both almost unanimously believed that now was the best time to go north and engage in a large-scale battle with the Union Army, and then approach Washington. The opportunity for war is fleeting, and we can't delay any longer. I will go to Richmond to meet the President. explain the current situation to the president in person. Robert Lee walked out of the command post quickly, jumped on his horse, and went to Richmond to ask for orders. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelis. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 668 Casualties. McClellan's Union Army and the Western Army are fighting fiercely in Nebraska. The Union Army on the north bank of Bull Run hastily assembled. We have a clear understanding of their troop deployment. Now is the best opportunity to defeat the Union Army. In the office of the Confederate president in Richmond, Robert Lee explained the pros and cons to Davis. If we miss this opportunity, we will regret it in the future. Your Excellency is also a military man and is well versed in military affairs. If this batch of mobilized soldiers of the Union Army completes training, we will be very passive. Davis retired with the rank of colonel. During the Battle of Buena Vista in the First Mexican-American War, Davis performed bravely and led the way, resulting in a bullet in the leg and becoming disabled. After recovering from his injury, then-President Bordeaux appointed Davis as a brigadier general to lead the militia brigade, but Davis refused President Bordeaux's appointment on the grounds that according to the Constitution, the power to appoint senior military officers lies with the state, not the federal government, let alone the president. This move won him deep political capital for his later abandonment of the military and entered politics, and won strong support from the state rights faction, especially the Southern state rights faction. Robert Lee was not trying to flatter Davis. As a veteran in the American military, Davis was indeed well versed in American military affairs. However, it was precisely because Davis was well versed in military affairs that he was hesitant to make up his mind to officially go to war with the North. He preferred to consolidate the independence of the South by means of diplomatic mediation and military deterrence. I know the situation of the Northern Army on the north bank of Bull Creek. The Potomac Army, the Shenandoah Army, and the Virginia Cavalry Brigade are certainly capable of defeating these hastily assembled and seriously undertrained mobilized soldiers in the North. Davis pondered for a moment and said helplessly, "But have you ever thought about it? Once the war starts, the right to end the war may not be in our hands. I know Lincoln's character. Once the war starts, if we cannot completely defeat the North, at least during Lincoln's term, we will definitely not be able to end the war, then we will completely defeat them. Liang Zhao is determined to go to war with the North. What are you worried about?" Robert Lee was very dissatisfied with Davis's remarks. At the beginning, either choose to accept the conditions of the Federation and stay in the Federation. Now that the relationship with the Federation has been completely torn apart, it is very foolish to still be entangled in the issue of whether to go to war or not and sit back and watch the opportunity slip away. We don't have enough ammunition. We only have one arsenal in Richmond, and now we lack raw materials. The production capacity of the arsenal is even worse than before independence. Davis expressed his difficulties. I have sent 3 waves of envoys to visit Britain and France, hoping to obtain their recognition and assistance, but there has been no news so far. Our envoys may have been illegally detained by the North. Insufficient military production capacity is Davis' biggest concern. Davis has personally served in the military, and he believes that the bravery and fighting skills of the Southern warriors are far better than those of the Northerners. But the premise is to provide the Southern warriors with enough ammunition and military supplies. Otherwise, no matter how brave and good the Southern Army is, its combat effectiveness will be greatly reduced. Davis has been waiting for a reply from Britain and France. As long as he gets the support of Britain and France, even if it is just a verbal promise at the beginning, giving him a reassurance, he has the courage to go to war directly with the North. The ammunition in stock is enough to support us in a large-scale battle, Robert Lee said. As for ammunition, we can buy it from the West. When the French army invaded Mexico, the West also provided a large amount of arms and military supplies to the French army. I think the arms and military supplies in the West must be very abundant, and we can still sell arms and military supplies to the French army at this juncture. You go back to Manassas first. I will hold a cabinet meeting to discuss the matter of starting a war and make a decision. Davis suddenly felt his eyes brighten and said to Robert Lee. On the other hand, after taking down Fort Goshen, Fort Cozad, and Fort Lexington, the main force of the Western Army launched a fierce attack on Fort Kearny and Fort Grand. Fort Kearny and Fort Grand are large forts, and both the firepower and the garrison are stronger than the 3 small forts attacked before. Even so, the Western Army still took down Fort Grand in 4 days with an absolute firepower advantage and killed and captured a regiment of the garrison of Fort Grand. At this point, of the 5 large and small forts in the Kearny Fortress Group, only Fort Kearny, where Mason was stationed in person, remained. This Mason is much tougher than he was 12 years ago. He refused to surrender. He refused to break out even if there was a way out. Could it be that he really wanted to live and die with Fort Kearny? To be loyal to the Federation? After 5 days of fighting, Sutter couldn't help but look at Mason, his former defeated general, with a new respect. It took 2 of our companies to take over Fort Grande. This siege was really hard to fight. Kruger, who had just returned from Fort Grande by train, paid more attention to the casualties and asked Sutter, "I heard that the artillery responsible for shelling Fort Kearny also suffered casualties these days. In the process of attacking Fort Kearny and Fort Grande, the Western Army suffered casualties for the first time. Although Grandburg had a regiment of the Union Army's regular garrison, and the 2 casualties of the Western Army were from the Utah Militia Brigade responsible for the attack, and such casualties in the siege were already a very good answer, Kruger still felt very painful. I was careless on the first day of the war. I didn't expect the Union Army to have heavy artillery that could fire 4,000 or 5,000 yards away. I accidentally lost 6 artillery groups to the artillery in Fort Kearny." Sutter frowned and asked Kruger, "Did the 3rd Artillery Regiment in Grandburg have any casualties?" 6 artillery groups, which is almost the casualties of an artillery company, and Sutter was heartbroken when he thought of this. Unlike cheap infantry, artillery is an elite force made with golden shells. No, the 3rd Artillery Regiment has been suppressing the artillery of Grandburg. And the casualties are all the infantry responsible for the final attack and capture of the fort, Kruger answered, and he was also puzzled. The Union Army has a cannon that can fire 4,000 or 5,000 yards? I haven't heard of it before. No matter how much the Napoleon cannon is modified, it can't fire at a range of 4,000 or 5,000 yards. The sound of the cannon doesn't sound like a Napoleon cannon. It may be a new cannon developed by the Federation, or it may be a new cannon they got from Europe. Does the Prussian army have such a cannon? Sartre pulled his sparse beard. There was no record of the Sacramento cannon being sold to the Union Army before the war, and the sound of the cannon didn't sound like a Sacramento cannon. Sartre was very curious about what kind of cannon the Union Army in Fort Kearny used. The Prussian army doesn't have a cannon that can fire that far, Kruger gave a very affirmative answer. Kruger kept in touch with his colleagues in Prussia, and he was sure that the Prussian army definitely didn't have a cannon that could fire 4,000 or 5,000 yards. This is weird. Could it be a new cannon sold to them by the British? Sartre speculated randomly. Chapter 669 Mason's Choice. The news of the fall of Grand Fort was transmitted to Fort Kearny via the wired telegraph. Mason calmly put down the telegraph in his hand and accepted the fact that Grand Fort had fallen. The fact that a regiment of the garrison at Grand Fort could hold out for 4 whole days under the fierce artillery fire of the Western Army without any external aid was considered to be a display of tenacity. "Sir, while the telegraph line is still open, should we ask for help from Commander McClellan?" The speaker was Mason's new adjutant, Colonel McCollum. As for Mason's original adjutant, Colonel John, he was killed by the Western Army's artillery in the artillery battle on the 2nd day, becoming the highest-ranking officer killed in the Union since the beginning of the war. The Civil War between the North and the West was the most intense war McCollum had ever experienced, far beyond the Mexican-American War that McCollum had participated in. After all, the Mexican artillery could not hold them down for 4 whole days without running out of ammunition. "Do you know why the Western Army still hasn't cut off the telegraph line at Fort Kearny?" Mason asked McCollum. "The Western Army wants to surround the point and attack the reinforcements," McCick blurted out without much thought. It was easy for the Western Army to cut off a few telegraph lines. The Western Army did not cut the telegraph lines and still kept Fort Kearny in contact with the outside world. The intention was already obvious. Not to mention him as a colonel, even an ordinary non-commissioned officer could guess the intention of the Western Army. So there is no point in asking for help. McClellan has already sent 2 regiments of militia to us before the war. He will not take the risk of sending reinforcements to Fort Kearny. Mason asked with a wry smile, "How many parent guns can be fired?" Mason was mentally prepared that Fort Kearny could not be defended, but the intensity of the Western Army's artillery bombardment was still far beyond Mason's expectations. Mason really wanted to know how many shells the Western Army had prepared for this battle. The Western Army's shells were thrown into the fort as if they were free, and they did not stop even at night. Mason and his soldiers had not slept well for 4 days and 4 nights. Everyone in the fort was exhausted to the extreme. There are only 13 parent guns that can be used normally, Mickek said with a frown. The problem we are facing now is not only the serious shortage of parent guns that can be used, but also the serious casualties of artillerymen. The artillery has lost nearly 2/3 of its personnel. According to the intensity of the artillery battle, I am afraid that in 2 days, facing the artillery bombardment of the Western Army, we will not have any ability to fight back. The defenders of Fort Kearny were able to fight back against the Sacramento guns of the Western Army, all relying on the parent guns. However, since the raw materials of the parent guns are mainly cast iron is relatively brittle, causing the parent guns to wear faster than ordinary artillery barrels and more prone to cracks. Therefore, the life of the parent guns is very short, with only a pitiful 300 rounds. After 4 days of high-intensity artillery battles, the batch of parent guns at Fort Kearny has basically exceeded their service life. Yesterday, there were 4 incidents of parent guns exploding, which directly reimbursed his 4 gun groups. The casualties of the 4 artillery crews were still minor. The most serious thing was that the explosion of the artillery barrel had a great impact on the morale of the artillerymen. Many crews of the parent guns refused to operate the parent guns whose service life had expired. This trend even spread to the artillery crews of the Napoleon Fortress. 13 guns, what an unlucky number. Mason frowned and asked, what are the casualties today? So far, the number of casualties has exceeded 370, and the number of seriously injured is equal to the number of casualties. The military doctors are already too busy, Mickek reported truthfully. Today, 46 militia soldiers wanted to escape from the fort and surrender to the Western Army and were caught. What should we do with these people? Lock them all in the dungeon first. Mason hesitated for a moment, but still took out a letter from the drawer and handed it to Mickek, ready to leave himself a relatively decent ending, but he didn't know whether Liang Zhao was willing to give him a decent one. After dark, take this letter to the Western Army camp and hand it over to the Western Army's highest commander. At night, the Western Army generals began to review today's battle. The Western Army generals also keenly noticed that the intensity of the counterattack of the defenders of Fort Kearny was getting weaker day by day. Several infantry brigade commanders even argued over which brigade was responsible for the main attack on Fort Kearny, and were scolded by Liang Zhao. Liang Zhao was not considering taking Fort Kearny, but how to take Fort Kearny at the lowest cost. Liang Zhao felt that the casualties were a bit high at the cost of 2 companies of casualties to take Fort Grande. The defenders of Fort Kearny were 4 times that of Fort Grande, the fort was more solid, and the firepower was more fierce. The attack on Fort Grande would inevitably cost more casualties. After the battle review, Liang Zhao left a few senior generals and handed the letter from Mason to everyone for reading. Perhaps he thought that he had held Fort Kearny for 4 full days, and he had lived up to the War Department and Lincoln. Or perhaps Mason could no longer see hope. Mason took the initiative to contact Liang Zhao and discuss the conditions. In the letter, Mason said that he was willing to give up Fort Kearny, provided that the Western Army allowed him to withdraw safely to Omaha with his subordinates. Is this Mason's conspiracy? Mason is quite cunning. Sutter suspected that Mason was cheating after reading Mason's letter. Mason doesn't have the capital to cheat us now. In the face of absolute strength, any conspiracy is invalid. Kruger didn't think Mason would cheat. As long as the main force of the Northern Army under McClellan's troops did not rush to support Fort Kearny, the Western Army had an overwhelming advantage over Mason's brigade, and Mason could not get out of their encirclement no matter how hard he tried. Kruger believed that Mason really wanted to negotiate with him. We can pretend to agree to Mason, and then surround Mason after Mason led his troops to withdraw from Fort Kearny. Field battles can better play our firepower advantage, and Mason's troops are now in a very low morale. It is not difficult to defeat and capture them, Elvis suggested. If Mason is willing to surrender Fort Kearny, it's okay to let him go back to Omaha. Liang Zhao stated his decision. Mason's brigade is already in our pocket. We are fully capable of taking it down. This is the elite standing brigade of the Northern Army. Sutter disagreed with letting Mason go. He hoped to annihilate Mason's brigade. Our target is McClellan, not Mason, Liang Zhao stated his reasons. McClellan and Mason have always been at odds. Let Mason go back to Omaha and argue with McClellan. I have captured Mason once 12 years ago. There is no point in capturing him again. As for Elvis' proposal, Liang Zhao also considered it. Doing so would naturally wipe out Mason's brigade at the lowest cost, but doing so would undoubtedly increase the difficulty of persuading the Northern Army to surrender in the future, which would not be worth the loss. What's more, 4 of the Kearny Fortress Group have been lost, and the remaining Fort Kearny garrison has also suffered heavy casualties. Mason's brigade has basically been crippled, and it is difficult to recover its combat effectiveness in a short period of time. Letting these remnants of Mason's brigade go back will not affect the war situation. Liang Zhao's strategic goal this time is to at least cripple the main force of the Union Army in Omaha, so that the Union Army cannot recover for at least a year. It is worthwhile to exchange a crippled Mason brigade for less casualties and more time to prepare for the decisive battle. I also agree to end the Battle of the Kearny Fortress Group as soon as possible, Kruger pointed to the map and said worriedly. According to the information detected by McQuick in Kansas, the main brigade and an unknown number of Union cavalry have bypassed northern Kansas. The vanguard is less than 100 kilometers away from us. I don't know the intention of this unit yet, but we need to free up our hands to deal with this Union unit that has bypassed our flank. Chapter 670 President Liang is such a gentleman. There are still some Union troops that dare to go around our flanks and prepare to fight a mobile war with us. Elvis was quite surprised when he heard the news. He couldn't help but look at this Union Army and their commander who dared to go around their flanks with new eyes. Unlike the more developed northeastern region, the northeastern region has a relatively developed infrastructure and a well-developed transportation network. However, in frontier areas with a relatively low level of development, such as Kansas, the infrastructure is very backward. So far, only Kansas City, located on the eastern border of Kansas, and St. Louis, Missouri, have railways in the entire Kansas. And 99% of the mileage of this railway is located in Missouri. Being able to get rid of dependence on railways and lead a brigade of troops to march in the wilderness of northern Kansas, the courage and organization of this main brigade can be said to be remarkable. The main brigade is a volunteer unit, and these volunteer units are currently one of the backbone forces of the Union Army, Kruger said. Although McQuick and his men did not find out which unit the Northern Army cavalry that moved to northern Kansas was from, the infantry had already identified the infantry brigade from the flags they held as the main brigade from Maine. The sudden mobilization and expansion of the Northern Army from more than 10,000 people to 300,000 people did not mean that all of these 300,000 people could be put into battle. In fact, the Northern Army now relies entirely on the original standing brigade and volunteer brigade, which are only tens of thousands of troops, to support this huge army. Sir, give me an artillery battalion, and I will take the Mexican brigade to drive them back to Kansas City. William Hawk, the commander of the Mexican militia brigade, volunteered to Liang Zhao with a very positive attitude. The other generals in the command headquarters almost agreed with William Hawk's initiative. The Mexican Militia Brigade, as the name suggests, is a militia brigade composed mainly of Mexicans in western Mexico. Mexico has rarely performed well in foreign wars in recent years, and the French army has easily defeated Mexico in a very short time recently. All these things give people an inherent impression that the Mexican army is not good at fighting. Therefore, the generals in the command center felt that the Mexican brigade was dispensable. Although its brigade commander, William Hawk, was not Mexican but a real Yankee, he was also despised by his colleagues. William Hawk's attitude was so positive that he wanted to prove to his colleagues that although his troops were mainly composed of Mexicans, they had nothing to do with the army of the neighboring country to the south. Not all generals agreed to let the Mexican brigade fight the main brigade. The commander of the artillery brigade, Sutter, opposed it because William Hawk asked to allocate an artillery battalion from the artillery brigade to him. Hawk, I don't ask you to defeat the main brigade, I just ask you to stop the main brigade in northern Kansas. Can you do it? Liang Zhao wanted to eat up the main brigade directly as a whole rather than defeating it. At the same time, he also wanted to understand through actual combat how the elite of the Northern Army fought in field battles and mobile warfare. His plan was to use the Mexican brigade to lure and pin down the main brigade, and then send 2 regiments of the 103rd Brigade to cut off the main brigade's retreat back to Kansas City, and then surround the main brigade from both wings and annihilate it. I guarantee on my honor that I can. If I fail to stop the main brigade, I will not be able to continue to be the brigade commander. William Hawk issued a military order. Okay, I'll give you this opportunity. Liang Zhao gave Hawk this opportunity. After the senior generals left, Liang Zhao left Kruger and asked him to draft a reply to Mason. Liang Zhao said to Kruger, "The troops in Fort Kearny are divided into two parts. One is Mason's brigade, and the other is the two militia regiments given to him by McClellan. Tell Mason that he and his troops can leave, but the two militia regiments must surrender on the spot. The guns, ammunition, mules, horses and livestock and stock must be handed over to us intact. Mason and McClellan have a bad relationship. If Mason only takes his troops back to Omaha, it will be a good show to watch." Kruger smiled maliciously. Liang Zhao did not let Mason wait too long. In Fort Kearny, the uneasy Mason received Kruger's reply that night. The weapons and ammunition in Fort Kearny could not be taken away anyway, so he had no objection to handing over the arsenal of Fort Kearny intact to the Western Army. However, after seeing the condition that the two militia regiments must surrender on the spot, Mason still hesitated. He knew that once he did this, there would be no chance of repairing the relationship between him and McClellan. But after a brief psychological construction, Mason reluctantly agreed to this condition. That night, Mason convened the surviving officers to hold the last military meeting in Fort Kearny, announced the decision to break out in the early morning, and emphasized intentionally or unintentionally that the breakout would be an extremely difficult battle and that they should be prepared to sacrifice at any time. The two militia colonels who were unaware of the situation showed fear after hearing that they were going to break out. Seeing this, Mason took advantage of the situation and said that they would be allowed to stay in Fort Kearny and surrender to the Western Army. The two militia commanders smiled and thanked Mason, and said a lot of nice words to praise their General Mason. After the meeting, Mason and his defeated troops could not wait to break out lightly. Along the way, Mason was in an extremely nervous state, worried that the Western Army would not keep its promise. After an hour of rapid march, running more than 7 kilometers, seeing that the Western Army did not show any signs of chasing and annihilating them, Mason's hanging heart was finally put down. Mason, who had escaped death, exclaimed to the officers gathered around him, "President Liang and his generals are really gentlemanly." All the northern officers and soldiers who survived the disaster nodded in agreement. When the sky in the east was turning pale, the Western Army finally entered Fort Kearny at the urging of the two militia regiment leaders of Fort Kearny and accepted the surrender of the defenders. "This is the first time I've seen such a hurry to surrender," Sutter laughed jokingly. "If you don't surrender, your artillery shells and rockets will raze Fort Kearny to the ground. How can you not be anxious?" the two militia regiment leaders argued. On May 25, 1861, the tattered stars and stripes over Fort Kearny was lowered and replaced by the rising white star flag. The 1,570 remnants of the two militia regiments cooperated very well and surrendered to the Western Army that took over Fort Kearny in an orderly manner, and handed over the military flag intact. The Kearny Fortress Group, which was built at great expense by the Northern Federation and praised by the Northern elites, only lasted less than 2 weeks under the artillery fire of the Western Army. The strategic attempt of the North to block the Western Army's way eastward with the Kearny Fortress Group and restrict the Western forces to the North Platte River Valley was completely bankrupt. In the Battle of the Kearny Fortress Group, Liang Zhao reaped a lot of rewards. From the 5 forts, he seized 186 Napoleon cannons that were still usable, 6 unknown cannons, Parrott cannons, 31 mortars, 4,750 guns of various types, 1.21 million rounds of rifle bullets of various colors, 53,642 rounds of various caliber shells, and 31,800 pounds of gunpowder. The rest of the seized military supplies included 840 horses, 210 cattle, 145 mules, 440 sheep, 565 pigs, and 24 tons of dry feed, 230,000 pounds of military rations, dry food, canned food, pickled meat, pickled vegetables, and more than 40,000 gallons of various alcoholic beverages, 3,750 packs of bandages, 2,080 bottles of painkillers, disinfectants, etc., 4,600 beddings and blankets, 600 military tents, 1,300 tools, etc. America is indeed the largest horse-producing country. The 5 garrison infantry regiments can gather nearly 1,000 military mules and horses. After reading this long list, Liang Zhao couldn't help but sigh that America during the Civil War had already revealed an amazing potential for war. Chapter 671, Destroy 10,000 enemies and move to Omaha. Oh, damn it, these fat politicians, instead of staying in Washington, come to the front to give me orders. How annoying. In Omaha, McClellan, the commander-in-chief of the Northern Army, who had just gotten rid of those disgusting congressmen, cursed. "I really want to kick these fat pigs' asses with my boots." After the outbreak of the war, many savvy congressmen realized that the front was a great place for them to perform political shows, and they brought their families to the front to watch the war. There were also a few congressmen who came to the front with an attitude of watching the fun. The front that the congressmen were initially more keen to go to was the Virginia front, in the core area of the East. Because there were too many congressmen going to the Virginia front in the East, and the Virginia front was very close to the capital Washington, there was nothing new. Soon, some congressmen took another way to come to the Nebraska front in the West to watch the war and show off. This added a lot of trouble to McClellan. McClellan, who had been busy and exhausted, not only had to meet the reasonable and unreasonable demands of the congressmen, but also had to protect the personal safety of these congressmen. As for the congressmen's claim that they would boost the morale of the soldiers on the front line by setting an example, it was nonsense. When these congressmen dressed in elegant dresses and appeared in front of the unkempt soldiers surrounded by their entourage, they were spotless and pointed fingers at the soldiers. The effect was more to undermine the morale of the soldiers on the front line, rather than to inspire them. The senior officers around McClellan remained silent. Their attitude towards these congressmen who came to the front to cause trouble was the same as McClellan's. They wanted to send these congressmen away immediately. However, they also knew that McClellan was just talking fast. If these congressmen put their fat butts on McClellan's face, McClellan would not have time to lick them, let alone greet them with military boots. "Sir, General Mason is back." When McClellan was upset, a lieutenant colonel walked into his office and reported to him that Mason had arrived in Omaha. "Oh, damn it. Mason has the nerve to come back. I even allocated him a whole brigade, an artillery regiment equipped with new artillery, and 2 infantry regiments. He has 3 solid forts, but he can't even last 2 weeks." Hearing the name Mason, McClellan was furious and shouted, "Let Mason roll over to see me." The loss of the Kearny Fort group greatly compressed the strategic depth of McClellan's corps. Next, Omaha, a frontier town, will have to face the Western Army. Obviously, this situation is not what McClellan, who is not fully prepared, wants to see. Previously, McClellan was willing to make up his mind to squeeze out an artillery regiment and 2 militias for Mason in the hope that Mason could buy him more time. Even if Mason only lasted 2 months, McClellan would accept it. In McClellan's plan, he could use 2 months to complete the training of 30,000 to 40,000 militia soldiers, so that these northern citizens and farmers who hurriedly enlisted in the army would have the basic qualities of a modern soldier. Once his troops were reorganized, the quality gap between his troops and the Western Army would be greatly narrowed. At that time, not to mention defeating the Western Army on the front battlefield. At least he had the confidence to stabilize the front and remain invincible. Although McClellan was only 35 years old and a very young federal general. But he was one of the few generals in the Union who acted steadily and used troops cautiously. Unlike the blind optimism of most federal generals, McClellan had carefully analyzed and studied the Western Army before taking office in Omaha. He concluded that the Western Army was highly professional, well-equipped, and had combat experience that was not inferior to that of the Southern Army. The hastily mobilized Northern Army could not defeat the Western Army in a frontal battle in the short term, even if it had a twofold advantage in strength. Of course, the Western Army also had shortcomings, that is, it was limited by the transportation capacity and logistics of the Pacific Railway. Even if the entire western side was mobilized, the upper limit of the number of troops that the western side could deploy in the central border area was relatively low. For this upper limit, McClellan gave an estimate of 80,000. The weakness of the Western Army was the advantage of the Northern Army in the Central Theater. After all, it was much easier for the Eastern region to provide logistical supplies to Omaha than for the Western region to provide logistical supplies to the North Platte Valley. The hateful thing was that Mason only persisted in the Kearny Fort group for 2 weeks, which was far from McClellan's psychological expectations. His plan was disrupted by Mason's rapid dam collapse. "Sir, I'm afraid it's not possible now," the lieutenant colonel lowered his head and said softly. "General Mason is telling the congressman about his heroic deeds of breaking through, and the congressmen want to keep him for dinner tonight." "Break through?" McClellan laughed in anger. "Then tell General Mason, tell this great, brave and fearless American hero, let him draft a telegram to the president to report the situation of the Kearny Fort group. No one knows what happened there better than him." After speaking, McClellan waved his hand to signal his subordinates to go out. He wanted to think about the next deployment quietly by himself. After his men left, McClellan walked to the sand table, pulled out the blue flag on Fort Kearny, and replaced it with a red flag representing the Western Army. McClellan's sight was focused on northern Kansas, and from time to time he looked at the northwestern mountains of Nebraska. After contemplating the sand table for a long time, McClellan took out a pen and paper and wrote down the words Maine Brigade, 1st Mercenary Regiment, etc. on the paper. On the night of May 29, 1861, Lincoln received 2 telegrams from Omaha. One was from Mason, who explained in the telegram that under his leadership, Mason's brigade had severely damaged the Western Army at the Kearny Fort Group, annihilated 10,000 enemies, and successfully broke through to Omaha, preserving the living force. The other telegram was sent by McClellan. In addition to asking Lincoln for soldiers and money as usual, McClellan also complained to Lincoln that the congressman kept going to Omaha to show off, which seriously affected his work. In addition, McClellan did not mention Mason's breakout and retreat to Omaha. General Scott, I think the situation in the West is not optimistic now. 2 days ago, General Shenandoah led the Pennsylvania Army to penetrate the town of Manassas and caught the Confederate Army by surprise. Lincoln was not happy for long before the news from the Western Front poured cold water on him. Lincoln was not an easy-to-fool public. Although he was not a professional soldier, he also understood that although Mason's telegram to him exaggerated the performance of Mason's brigade, the unavoidable fact was that the Northern Army lost the Kearny Fortress Group. As for Mason's claim in the telegram that he annihilated 10,000 enemies, it was even more nonsense. If the Western Army was really annihilated by 10,000 people, the casualties of the Western Army were at least 30,000. This means that the Western Army lost a full half of its manpower. If all this were true, the Western Army would have retreated to the Platte Valley in disgrace by now. It's not just not optimistic, it's terrible. Mason is really outrageous. He is the second Anderson. No. He is not even as good as Anderson. Scott was extremely disappointed with Mason's performance, even though Mason was once his student. Mason's performance reminded Scott of Anderson during the Battle of Fort Sumter. The performance of these Northern juniors was really disappointing. Then let him enjoy Anderson's treatment and roll back from the front, Lincoln said coldly to Nicola beside him with a blank expression. Nicola, send a telegram to Omaha and ask General Mason to return to Washington to receive the award. Although McClellan said nothing, Lincoln knew that the relationship between McClellan and Mason was not harmonious, and it was inappropriate to let Mason continue to stay in Omaha at this time. Your Excellency's decision couldn't be wiser. Scott agreed with Lincoln's decision very much. Although this was the second funeral and wedding, they had to do it. Send a telegram to General Shenandoah to take Manassas. We need a real victory to boost morale. After weighing the pros and cons, Lincoln made a decision. Mason had just been defeated, and McClellan's Western Army would probably find it difficult to wipe out the Western Army that had come out in full force in a short period of time. In contrast, the Northern Army had more advantages on the Eastern Front. Lincoln decided to take a retreat on the Western Front, maintaining the front line at Omaha and pinning down the main force of the Western Army. He chose the Eastern Front as the breakthrough point. After all, the Northern Army had just won the victory in Manassas at Bull Creek, and the morale of the Pennsylvania Army of Shenandoah was high at this time. Chapter 672 Debate. After taking down the Kearny Fortress Group, the whole army slaughtered pigs and sheep with the captured livestock, held a full animal banquet, and rewarded the three armies. As for cattle, mules and horses, they were still valuable means of production during the interval between the two industrial revolutions, and Liang Zhao was reluctant to slaughter them. Thanks to the full preparation for this war, the Western Army had abundant supplies, and the soldiers in the central border area could usually eat meat. However, the meat they could usually eat was mostly canned and pickled meat, and the fresh meat they could eat was basically hunted deer and American bison. Fresh large livestock meat was also a rare delicacy for the Western Army soldiers. Liang Zhao and a group of principals of the corps layer of the Western Army in Fort Kearny roasted a bonfire and ate skewers of meat. The Northern Army in Omaha are all new recruits who have just joined the army. We should take advantage of the victory and capture Omaha. Eliminate the main force of the Northern Army. Sartre grabbed a handful of chili powder with his greasy hands and sprinkled it on the pork skewers. I agree with Mr. Suther's proposal. Although we have just won a victory and captured the Kearny Fortress Group, the main force of the Union Army has suffered almost no losses. We should send troops to Omaha as soon as possible to fight a decisive battle with the main force of the Union Army. Elvis's views coincided with Sutter's, and he also pointed out, McClellan is a general who is very good at training soldiers. The longer the decisive battle is delayed, the more disadvantageous it will be for us. I admit that a quick decisive battle with the Union Army is the most favorable decision for us, but gentlemen, please don't forget that our flank is not safe. Kruger was more cautious. He reminded Sutter and Elvis. All our elite troops are here. We can only win the battle with the main force of the Union Army, not lose. To be precise, even a miserable victory is a failure. Flank? Kruger, do you mean the main brigade that detoured to northern Kansas? Elvis turned his head and looked at Kruger. We have sent the Mexican militia brigade to stop them. I know many of us are skeptical about the Mexican militia brigade's combat effectiveness and don't trust them, but with just a main brigade, even if those Mexicans fail to defeat them, we have enough reaction time to remedy the situation. Elvis had trained the Mexican government's army in his early years, and he also inspected William Hawke's Mexican militia brigade before the war. To be honest, the Mexican militia brigade is indeed not trustworthy. Not to mention that compared with the three regular infantry brigades 101, 102, and 103, the Mexican brigade's combat effectiveness is worrying. Even compared with other state militias of the same level, the Mexican brigade's combat effectiveness is probably the weakest militia brigade. Although compared with the Mexican troops of the Mexican government, the Spanish Army's Mexican militia brigade has been completely transformed. However, Elvis still believes that the combat effectiveness of the Mexican militia brigade can reach the average level of the Northern Army. Considering that the Mexican militia brigade is better equipped than the Northern Army, Elvis believes that with the same number of troops, the Mexican militia brigade can delay the main brigade. It is true that those Mexicans are not trustworthy, but the officers of the Mexican militia brigade are either graduates from military academies or veterans promoted from the old 3rd Regiment. They are still trustworthy, Sartre said. With them as a backup, I think our flank security can still be guaranteed. The so-called Old 3rd Regiment refers to the three regular infantry regiments of the Western Brigade before the Civil War, namely the California Infantry Regiment, the Oregon Infantry Regiment, and the Arizona Infantry Regiment. But all this is based on the premise that the enemy of the Mexican militia brigade is only the main brigade. Kruger thought for a moment and said, Kruger, do you mean that there are other Union troops in North Kansas? Don't you even trust our cavalry? Elvis said unhappily. He thought Kruger was a little too cautious. North Kansas is very large. We only have a few hundred scouts sent to North Kansas. It is impossible for a few hundred scouts to investigate in an area as large as Belgium and the Netherlands combined. It is impossible to be comprehensive and foolproof, Kruger said. Kruger, if we follow your idea completely and only fight battles that we are 100% sure of, we shouldn't be here, Elvis said sarcastically. Okay. Be quiet. Liang Zhao stopped the two people from arguing. It is a strategic decision to fight a decisive battle with the main force of the Northern Army. There is no doubt about that. Kruger's worry is not unreasonable. The whole army will advance to Omaha as planned. I will keep a reserve in Kearney to prepare for any eventuality. Reserve? Do we have additional reserves, sir? Kruger asked. Pratt still has more than 2,000 Guangxi soldiers who are almost trained, Liang Zhao said. At the same time, thousands of miles away in Sydney, Australia, Martin, the head of Umbrella in Australia, finally met Sir Henry Berkeley, who had just been promoted to the governor of New South Wales. In the mid-19th century, although each Australian colony, such as Victoria, South Australia, Queensland, etc., had its own governor, the governor of New South Wales was actually regarded as the highest executive officer of the entire Australia due to its historical status and the importance of the place, and was the most important representative of the British Empire in Australia. Governor, it's not easy to meet you. Martin looked at Sir Henry Berkeley coldly. Umbrella has been engaged in gold mining business in Australia for 10 years. Although there were conflicts between Umbrella and the governors of various states, Umbrella's gold mining business in Australia has developed smoothly under the guidance of gold. Umbrella and the colonial authorities of various states in Australia have a mutually beneficial relationship. Until this year, the situation in America changed suddenly, and the policy direction of the London authorities in Australia also changed abruptly. Facing this old friend who he had known for many years when he was the governor of Victoria, Henry Berkeley's attitude was quite polite. After all, Australian governors, including him, have been eating a lot in this gold mining feast in Australia over the years. Of course, this is just one of the reasons. Another deeper reason is that Umbrella directly or indirectly controls more than 200 large and small mines in New South Wales, Victoria, Western Australia and other places, and more than 600,000 miners rely on Umbrella to survive. If it were not for the huge pressure from London, Henry Buckley would not mind continuing to cooperate with Martin to maintain the current situation in Australia. Mr. Martin, we are always good friends in private, and the door of Sydney Governor's Palace is always open to you, Henry Buckley said. I am not here for our private affairs today, I am here for official business. Faced with Governor Buckley's show of goodwill, Martin's attitude did not soften at all. Oh? Then let's talk about official business, Mr. Martin. Buckley suddenly put away his smile and said with a straight face. Chapter 673 The Emperor's Visit. Our company has been doing business in Australia since 1851, and our contribution to Australia's development is obvious to all, Martin said in a resounding voice. Our company has always abided by the law. In 1856, you required each Chinese immigrant to pay a £5 entry tax. After negotiation, we accepted a £2 entry tax for each Chinese immigrant. Now you don't even discuss it with us. The new immigration restriction bill directly raises the original £2 entry tax to £25. It also restricts all kinds of merchant ships to only carry one Chinese per 100 tons into Australian ports. With all due respect, our company cannot and will not accept such rude and discriminatory terms. The claim that Umbrella abides by the law is debatable. Umbrella can gain a foothold in Australia, where prisoners are everywhere, monopolize the Australian gold mining industry, and compete with a British East India Company in Australia. Naturally, it is not a good company. But what Martin said was also true. On the surface, Umbrella Corporation did comply with the laws of the Australian colonial authorities. In addition, the laws of the British Empire were well known for their flexibility. In a nutshell, Umbrella Corporation was indeed a law-abiding company. Henry Buckley knew that the fundamental conflict between them and Umbrella Corporation this time was not whether Umbrella Corporation complied with the laws of the Australian colonies and whether it paid taxes in full and on time. Instead, the population structure of Australia caused concerns in London. Excluding the Aborigines, there are now 1.5 million white immigrants from Britain, Ireland and continental Europe in Australia. The remaining major ethnic groups are 500,000 Chinese and 30,000 to 40,000 white people from the Americas. Obviously, London believes that such a population structure is not conducive to their rule over Australia. Berkeley's predecessor, Governor Augustus, was dismissed by the Imperial Cabinet on the grounds that he accepted huge bribes during his tenure, was unable to effectively manage the colonies, and had an overly close personal relationship with Liang Zhao. As for Augustus's crime, accepting bribes was simply nonsense. The word clean has nothing to do with the governor of the British Empire. The deep reason for Augustus' dismissal was that he failed to control the population structure of the Australian colonies. Legal provisions are fixed, but people are flexible, said Berkeley. In 1856, there was a provision in the Victoria region that only one Chinese person could enter the port for every 100 tons. In the end, you might as well bypass the legal provisions and enter the port from the ports in the region. Similarly, Mr. Martin, we have not restricted your company from recruiting employees of other ethnic groups to work in Australia. The new immigration restriction bill restricts the entry of Chinese into Australia. You can hire Europeans, Americans, and even Japanese and Southeast Asian natives to come to Australia to work for you, sir. Don't you think this is absurd? If these white prisoners in Australia can build Australia well, why did you introduce Chinese immigrants in the first place? Martin sneered. Martin, you are also white, why do you have to work for the Chinese? Berkeley tried to win over Martin. Martin is the person in charge of Umbrella in Australia. If Martin can be successfully won over, solving the Chinese problem in Australia will be twice the result with half the effort. Of course, it is a great achievement. If you are willing to serve the British Empire, I promise you that our great British Empire can not only give you a governor of the Australian region, but Her Majesty the Queen will not be stingy with the title. Martin, you are Irish, and we are compatriots. Seeing that Martin was unmoved, Berkeley played the compatriot card, trying to close the distance between the two. Compatriots? When my father, mother, and sister starved to death in Ireland, You English people didn't treat us as compatriots. Martin stood up and said in a very clear attitude, "Sir, please watch your words. I am now a citizen of the American Republic, and I only serve the American Republic, whether it is out of personal feelings or objective factors. Martin will not make the stupid decision to betray Umbrella and Liang Zhao. His family is in California, and more than 90% of Umbrella's employees in Australia are Chinese, and these people will not follow him to pledge allegiance to the British. Most importantly, Liang Zhao gave him trust and a sense of belonging when he was in the most difficult time, which the British could not give him. Martin has no dissatisfaction with his current situation. What's more, the promises made by the people of England are worthless in his eyes. That's a pity, Mr. Martin. We don't agree. I'm afraid we can't continue the conversation." Buckley shrugged his shoulders to express his regret. London's treatment of the former Governor-General Augustus has sent a very clear signal to the Governors-General of Australia. Even if the Queen is far away, Buckley dare not go against the will of London. The Queen government has never been interested in overseas Chinese. The only new American regime that can provide protection for overseas Chinese is mired in the quagmire of civil war. Buckley himself also believes that now is the best time to solve the problem of Chinese in Australia. On May 27, 1861, Napoleon III, the Emperor of the Second French Empire, took a special train to visit the new American Republic after completing the expedition to Mexico. The American Republic attaches great importance to the visit of the French Emperor. This is the first time that a leader of a major country has visited the American Republic since its establishment. The American Republic received Napoleon III in the largest city, Jinshan, with the highest standards. In order to welcome Napoleon III, Jinshan Central Railway Station has been suspended since yesterday. The White Star flag and the tricolor flag were hung everywhere in the train station, and a huge color portrait of the heads of state of the two countries was hung in the center of the train station building. Vice President and Senate President Fremont, Secretary of State Pan Zhanghui, Speaker of the House of Representatives Wu Yuanhua, Minister of the Interior Gu Wen and other dignitaries of the American Republic, as well as Liang Zhao's parents and wife, all arrived at the Central Railway Station in advance to wait for the arrival of Emperor Napoleon III. French Ambassador Li Goff also arrived at Jinshan Central Railway Station with the staff of the French Embassy. Play music. As soon as Napoleon III's special train entered the station and stopped steadily, Fremont personally gave orders to the musicians who had been ready. The musicians immediately played the long-rehearsed Imperial March. Napoleon III walked off the train to the high-pitched and solemn melody. His shiny eyes stepped on the red carpet, and a confident smile appeared on his solemn face. He waved to everyone calmly. Following behind him was a team of French Royal Guards in neat uniforms. The tall and well-proportioned members of the Royal Guards held a golden-topped flagpole with the imperial tricolor flag hanging on it, which fluttered in the wind. After reviewing the honor guard of the American Republic, Zoe held a silver-edged welcome scroll and saluted the French Emperor respectfully, speaking in French with a Breton accent. "Welcome, Your Majesty. It is an honor for all citizens of our country to have you visit our country. President of our country, my husband is now on the front line, and he is very sorry that he cannot be there to greet you. Here, I would like to express my deepest apologies to you. Our French girls are so dignified and decent." Napoleon III understood the current situation facing the American Republic. Influenced by his uncle, Napoleon III himself was also a person who liked to lead the army in person and do everything personally. Liang Zhao was unable to be there to greet him in person, and Napoleon III did not care too much. Chapter 674. He wants to improve. God save the Emperor, long live the Emperor, long live France. The French expatriates who came to the train station spontaneously saw their emperor with their own eyes and cheered with tears in their eyes. Although Napoleon III was an emperor, he was not a hereditary emperor in the strict sense, but was legally elected by French citizens within the framework of the republican system. Before the Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III had a very high reputation in the minds of the French. Especially now that Napoleon III is not a new emperor, but has defeated Tsarist Russia in the Crimean War, smashed the Vienna system, and put France back in its rightful place, completing the revenge on Tsarist Russia. Moreover, Napoleon III has now successfully conquered Mexico and replanted the French tricolor flag on the North American continent. All of this makes the French at home and abroad feel that this emperor is very much like his uncle, and they also believe that France can return to the top of the world under the leadership of this emperor. Perhaps infected by the enthusiasm of the French expatriates, or perhaps out of the desire to join in the fun, many locals followed suit and shouted in broken French, "I didn't see you so excited when the King of Hawaii visited." Some people in the crowd began to whisper, "How can the king of a small country be compared with a monarch of a big country? After all, he is the monarch of a big country. His bearing and posture, wow, are not something that a monarch of a small country can compare with." The American Republic is an immigrant country. The main ethnic group is the Chinese who immigrated from the Qing dynasty. To be honest, their cultural level is not high. But thanks to the developed newspaper industry in the American Republic and freedom of speech, they have become very different from the ignorant people of the Qing dynasty. At least they are not completely ignorant of the outside world. They have heard of the major countries on the European continent because these countries often appear in newspapers. After meeting with the main politicians of the American Republic and personally greeting the expatriates who came to greet him, Napoleon III took a carriage to tour the city of San Francisco as usual. The first community he visited was the French expatriate community next to Republic Avenue. Thanks to the local government's relatively open and tolerant immigration policy, California has attracted tens of thousands of French people to settle down and form its own French community over the past decade of the gold rush. The French expatriate community in San Francisco is the largest French community in the entire West Coast region, with more than 30,000 French-speaking expatriates. About a quarter of the French expatriates have been naturalized, and the rest still retain their French nationality. French Ambassador Liang Zhao was fortunate to have the opportunity to ride in a carriage with Napoleon III. Liang Zhao was very excited. This was the emperor's affirmation of his work and a rare opportunity for him to perform in front of the emperor. "Since 1851, you have come here as a representative of the Bank of France to conduct business. I have read your reports and you have done a good job." Napoleon III first affirmed Liang Zhao's sincerity over the years, but he immediately changed the subject and said meaningfully, "For 10 years, a full 10 years, the business of the Bank of France and our influence have been limited to the small gold mountain. This is far from enough. The status of the Bank of France and the British Bank of Barings are both the vanguards of the foreign capital expansion of these old capitalist countries, not just banks. In the 19th century, banks that could be opened abroad were basically endorsed by their own governments. There were pure multinational commercial banks, but they were few and far between, and they were basically concentrated in a corner of the European continent where the capital market was the most mature. France's overseas colonial expansion was not late, but as a relatively traditional land power country, France did far less well in this regard than Britain on the other side. In addition, under the confinement of the Vienna system, France was suppressed for more than 30 years. France's overseas expansion results can be said to have started early and caught up late. There are very few French banks like the Gentian branch of the Bank of France that do not rely on local blood transfusions, but can feed back to the local area with real money every year. Of course, the insignificant results of France's colonial expansion are relative to Britain. Compared with the rising stars such as Prussia and Italy, which did not even have the qualifications to fight for land under the sun at this time, France's colonial expansion is undoubtedly very successful. Your Majesty is wise. Although the profits of gold mining and industrial mining are lucrative, they cannot be compared with a chemical industry. This is a different time. In the past, the West Coast developed smoothly. Not to mention foreign capital, even capital from the eastern United States could not get involved in the petrochemical industry. Liang Zhao has been working in California for 10 years. He is the Frenchman who knows the west coast of North America best. He knows very well that as early as 5 years ago, the petrochemical industry in Los Angeles has replaced the gold mining industry and become the most important pillar industry for the West Coast authorities. Under the high-intensity mining, the gold mines in California are rapidly depleting at a visible speed, while the oil in Los Angeles seems to be inexhaustible. Until now, the petrochemical industry in Los Angeles is still expanding rapidly. The North American Civil War, the British now have the idea of regaining Hong Kong Island and expelling Umbrella from Australia, and even the Russians have extended their hands to places like Ezo. Given the current situation of the American Republic, it is not difficult to get our French investors to enter the Los Angeles petrochemical industry you mentioned with a little operation. The key is how much return on investment we can get from Los Angeles. And I want more than just economic returns. Ligoff, you are not a banker now, but our French ambassador. You can't just weigh the economic gains and losses, Napoleon I said slowly. In addition to Los Angeles, they have also been mining oil in North Borneo and Texas in recent years. I think there must be oil in other parts of the world. Perhaps there has always been oil buried under the ground of France and French colonies, but we have never discovered it. Napoleon I firmly believe that there was oil in other parts of the world, even in France itself. It's just that the technology for oil exploration is currently only mastered by these petrochemical capitals on the West Coast. Compared with investing in Los Angeles to enjoy dividends, Napoleon I is more interested in oil exploration technology and supporting refining and processing technology. Remember your Majesty's teachings, Ligoff lowered his head and replied. He was eager to show himself in front of Napoleon I and promote deeper cooperation between France and the American Republic. This was not only because the local dignitaries treated him very well, but also for his own future. He didn't want to be just an ambassador forever, he wanted to make progress. From the perspective of political investment, Liang Zhao is a rare and high-quality investment target. At this point, Ligoff paused and carefully raised his eyes to observe Napoleon I's reaction. Go on. Napoleon I had no extra expressions, and his face was so calm that it was hard to understand. Chapter 675 High-Quality Allies. In fact, we have been investing in the American Republic since 1850. We came to Gold Mountain at almost the same time as the British, but the American Republic is much friendlier to us, France, than to the British. The American Republic and the British have territorial disputes in the north. The British are worried that their rise will threaten the Colombian territory, but we, France, do not have this concern. Not only can we maintain friendly diplomatic relations with the American Republic, but if necessary, we can also consider forming an alliance with it, allowing them to contain the British North American colonies, other colonies, and even the British East India Company. Of course, how to deal with the relationship with the American Republic in the end depends on your Majesty's holy judgment. Ligoff talked freely, hoping to facilitate the formal establishment of diplomatic relations between France and the American Republic, or even further, a direct alliance. Your Majesty, the biggest obstacle to the rise of France is not Russia, not Prussia, but Britain. The American Republic not only has a direct conflict of interest with the British in North America, but they also have irreconcilable conflicts of interest in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and even Australia. Tromron, a French naval commander in the same car, also supported Ligoff's proposal. The biggest competitor of the French Navy in overseas colonies is the British Royal Navy, and the French Navy has long been at a disadvantage in the competition with the British Royal Navy. As a naval commander, Tromron naturally hopes to have more allies overseas who can contain the British naval power, and hopes that Napoleon I will invest more resources in naval construction. There is no doubt that Liang Zhao is a rare and high-quality ally. Although France and the American Republic also have conflicts on overseas interests, for example, in the Second Trade War with China, Liang Zhao was neutral in name, but actually secretly provided military assistance to his uncle Liang Zhao, causing huge casualties to the French Expeditionary Force. For example, on the issues of Borneo Island and the Indochina Peninsula, especially the Vietnam issue, there are also differences of interest between France and the American Republic. But these do not touch the core interests of the empire and can be negotiated, at least Tromron thinks so. Why do General Tromron and Ambassador Ligoff avoid the Mexican issue? Army General Eli Ferdinand Faure looked at Ligoff and Tromron with a somewhat unfriendly look, and he emphasized, I think there is a fundamental conflict of interest between France and the American Republic. If they had not used troops against Mexico, Your Majesty would have been able to capture a complete Mexico instead of an incomplete one. I don't believe they have no intention of taking the whole of Mexico for themselves. That is why we must properly handle diplomatic relations with the American Republic in order to consolidate the empire's rule in Mexico. As for annexing the whole of Mexico, the top leaders of the American Republic certainly have this idea, but as you said, they have just taken over northern Mexico not long ago and have not even digested it yet. At least for 10 years, they will not be able to implement this idea even if they have it. Ligoff was hesitant to speak. Napoleon I knew what Ligoff wanted to say next. In this French expedition, the American Republic did not remain neutral, but unexpectedly provided logistical and intelligence support to the French army. With the French army's might, it was not difficult to capture a mere Mexico. Without the help provided by the American Republic, the French army could easily win this expedition, but the price of victory was higher. It is easy to conquer colonies but difficult to defend them. How to maintain the rule over Mexico at a relatively low cost is undoubtedly a test for Napoleon III. If the relationship with the American Republic can be handled well, it will be of great benefit to France's rule in Mexico in the short term. The American Republic will have a large-scale battle with the United States in the near future. Whether the American Republic is worthy of our deep friendship will be revealed after this battle, Napoleon III said. In the evening, Fremont and others held a grand banquet to welcome the French representatives headed by Napoleon III, and Napoleon III was invited to attend the banquet. It's just that when talking about the establishment of diplomatic relations between the two countries, Napoleon III has always avoided this issue. To be precise, Napoleon III is not avoiding the major issue of the establishment of diplomatic relations between France and the United States, but he wants to discuss the diplomatic relations between the two countries face-to-face with Liang Zhao. After all, Liang Zhao can only make the final decision on many core interests of the American Republic. Although Liang Zhao is called the president, the power he holds is much greater than that of Lincoln, the president of the United States, and Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Even better than him, the French emperor. In Nebraska, the heat wave steamed up mirages on the rails, and the charred pine sleepers were still smoking. When Wudakin, the head of the engineering corps, and his engineers worked together with crowbars to pry the twisted rails apart, he could vaguely smell the smell of his beard burning. It was the gunpowder smoke left on his beard from the explosion 2 hours ago. The twisted rails and exploded sleepers around Wudakin were scattered on the charred roadbed. A group of strong men in gray engineer coats were waving crowbars like him, prying up the deformed rails one by one. Next to the rails was a raging furnace, and the engineers who were blacksmiths were hammering the rails with their bare chests. A tall figure rode a chestnut horse and slowly approached, and the black riding boots stained with mud and water trembled slightly in the stirrups. Wudakin temporarily stopped his work, wiped the beads of sweat from his forehead, and looked up at the cavalry officer, only to see the colonel's epaulets on his shoulders. This man was Liang Zhao, one of the veterans of the Western Army Cavalry, who was born in the Liang Zhao Indian native tribe. Zhao was his real name, and as for his surname, they simply took the surname of President Liang in order to flatter themselves. Behind Liang Zhao were 70 or 80 cavalrymen carrying volcanic stone rapid-fire rifles, escorting more than 20 Northern Army prisoners who had just been captured back to the camp. Liang Bison took a look at the progress of the engineering corps, and his face instantly became as gloomy as the Mississippi River in winter. His hawk-like eyes swept over the messy and flustered engineers, and shouted at Wudakin, "Wudakin! The Yankees will not wait for you to leisurely hammer out a new railway. General Kruger said that the rails must be able to run trains in 7 days, otherwise, you engineers will have to push the trains, leisurely as hell. Haven't you seen that I, the commander of the engineering corps, am being used as an engineer?" Wudakin said angrily. "The Yankees are so fucking wicked. Not only did they blow up the railway, but they also blew it up in sections. When we get to Illinois, we will also blow up the Illinois Railway into sections and let the Yankee engineers slowly repair it." After Mason fled to Omaha, McClellan immediately sent cavalry engineers to destroy the railway. Although Kruger also sent cavalry to protect the railway at the first time, he drove away and captured many Northern troops who destroyed the railway. However, the railway from Grand Island to Omaha was too long, 240 kilometers long, and it was difficult to defend. There were still hundreds of sections of railway destroyed by the Northern Army. Because the damaged sections of the railway were very scattered, the engineers of the Engineer Corps had to divide into groups to repair the damaged railway. It's better to build than to repair. It's faster to build a new railway than to repair it now, a sergeant who was a railway engineer muttered. Another sergeant with coal dust on his face raised his arm to wipe the sweat from his forehead and said to Liang Zhao, "Colonel, this job can't be rushed. The rails must be heated and the seams must be aligned, otherwise our trains will be more dangerous than the guns of the Northerners." Wudakin collected a few packs of Wasp brand cigarettes and distributed them to Liang Zhao. "Big Zhao, you are an old school officer and you can have a say in front of the general. Go back and talk to the general to add some more people and 2-track presses for us." The so-called old school officers are the school officers of the Western Brigade period, and correspondingly, the new school officers are the military academy students promoted after the expansion of the army, such as Wudakin. Therefore, although Wudakin and Liang Zhao are both colonels, Wu Deqin is more respectful to Liang Yinyu, who has more seniority. I will report to General Kruger after I return to the camp, but I'm not sure whether I can get anyone to come. You should prepare for the worst and repair the railway as soon as possible." Liang Yinyu was very pleased. He took a deep puff of the cigarette, turned his horse's head, nodded to the patrolling sentry in the distance, signaling them to continue marching along the railway. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.